Chapter 1. Blake squinted down at the pad of paper in front of him. What in tarnation was this supposed to be a sketch of? There were two parts to the picture, so it was probably a compound word. The left half of the paper looked like. Was that a squirrel? No, it had rings around its eyes. A raccoon. He took a second to scowl at his boss, Wyatt, who was seated on his right, then jotted down raccoon, and moved to the next half. It looked like a stick figure, definitely a woman, judging by the size of the two circles Wyatt had sketched on her chest, who appeared to be shopping. Raccoon shopping? What the heck did that mean? Shrugging, Blake jotted down his guess, just as the buzzer went off. Chuckling, Artie stood up and waved her hands. Okay, everyone, pass your pads of paper to your left, and they should be back with the original owner. They were playing a game called Telestrations, which, as near as Blake could figure, was a cross between the old childhood game telephone, where kids whispered phrases in each other's ears and passed it on until I have to pee became Sam smells like a baboon, and the drawing game illustration. Basically, one person wrote a phrase on a piece of paper and handed it to the next guy, who flipped it over and tried to illustrate the phrase. The next person had to write down what the sketch looked like, and it kept going. Since Wyatt was playing, the sketches tended to turn naughty. Blake grinned. Maybe the two of them shouldn't have been seated next to each other. You know, he muttered under his breath to his boss, game nights used to be easier when it was just us guys, and Rusty. Yeah, Wyatt returned with a drawl and a wink, but they weren't as much fun. For a few years now, there'd been a rotating weekly poker night on Caudron Valley Ranch. Blake and Seth, Blake's best friend, were regulars, as were Rusty, Chad and Rhodey, who were other ranch hands. Seth's boss, Jim, rarely joined anymore, and Wyatt, Blake's boss at the racetrack, tended to miss plenty of weekly games now that he was married. In fact, it seemed as if everyone were getting married these days. Blake grinned and rested one booted foot on his opposite knee. That's why they had to switch to game nights instead, just to have space for everyone. There was still a poker game going on someplace, but since tonight was Blake's turn to host, he'd invited the wives too. Artie was Wyatt's wife, and since this game was her idea, she was the one collecting all the points. Her sister, Aria, was very newly married to Seth, and the two of them were sitting on the couch across the way, occasionally sharing a secret smile. Their other sister, Athena, they had about 1 million siblings, it seemed like, was sitting on her husband Aaron's lap, occasionally feeding him chips and giggling. The big man just smiled happily at his brand new wife. The rest of them might have felt left out, but it was kind of funny to see the couples all lovey-dovey. Blake was happy for them, honestly, but it was clear not everyone was. Rhodey was ignoring most of them, chatting with Joe and Chad, two ranch hands who'd decided to sit this game out, but Rusty was frowning at Aaron and Athena's public display of affection. Of course, she hadn't been looking too great the last few times Blake had seen her, so maybe she was just suffering from an upset stomach or something. Okay, I'm going to read mine first, everyone, so listen up. With a flourish, Artie flipped the pad of paper she held back to the beginning. Now, the phrase I started with was doggy bag. I see that Aria drew a fairly credible dog, good work, he looks just like my pup Wager, and well, I guess that could be a purse? She flipped the page. And looks like Seth guessed dog purse, which works. While the others chuckled, she flipped the page again. Okay, Athena drew one of those miniature poodles, actually, I'm impressed with the details, Athena, inside a purse, but she's got a #1 and #2 with arrows pointing to the dog and the purse, very smart. So on the next page Aaron wrote poodle plus sack, which works. She flipped to Wyatt's page, then scowled. And I see how my husband managed to screw it up. Is this supposed to be a dog? Why does it have rings around its eyes? Thank you. Blake shot out, teasing Wyatt. And what's with the second picture? Is she shopping? Wyatt scowled and waved his hand dismissively. How else was I supposed to draw a sack? Artie clucked her tongue as she turned the page. And Blake, completely justifiably, as far as I'm concerned, wrote raccoon shopping. She rolled her eyes. It was supposed to be doggy bag, but honestly, this one wasn't as screwed up as some of the others my husband's gotten his hands on. Whoa, hey. Wyatt protested, to general laughter. Blake's the one who drew that elaborately naughty doodle for eye candy, when something simpler would have worked. You're not wrong, Blake drawled. From across the room, Seth lifted his can in salute and smiled lazily. Blake could probably manage to turn anything into a naughty metaphor. I used to be like that too, Wyatt admitted, offering his wife a charming smile, but I had to stop when I got married. Used to? Blake protested, but Aaron was already chuckling. What are you going to do when you start bringing dates to these game nights, Blake? Or, God forbid, a wife? Seth burst into laughter at that. Blake? He shook his head, trying to get control of himself. Even his wife Aria was chuckling. Can you imagine Blake married? Or, hell, even dating the same woman more than twice in a row? Knowing he had an image to maintain, Blake shrugged and pushed himself to his feet in one languid movement. Well, what can I say? There's a lot of ladies out there, and I don't want to disappoint any of them. Who are you taking out this weekend? Sandy Elliott? He scoffed. I haven't seen Sandy in, almost a year, I think. Nah, I was thinking about calling up that cute redhead who waits tables at the bar on 3rd Street. She slipped me her number last week. Arya shook his head, chuckling. I'll bet you don't remember her name, do you? Blake shoved his hands in his pockets, trying to look innocent when he winked. I don't need to know her name to ask her out. I know she's a lovely lady, who has an eye for handsome cowboys. Sorry, but that leaves most of you out of the running. While the laughter faded into a discussion about the next illustration, Blake headed for the kitchen. He'd made appetizers, but was waiting on the pizza to be delivered. He went ahead and scooped some of the nachos onto his plate and popped the top of another can. Resting his hip against a windowsill, he slipped a cheese-covered tortilla chip in his mouth and peered down the street outside. He lived on the ranch, in the little neighborhood the Caudrons had started building a few generations back. All the houses were pretty compact, but the 2-bedroom he rented had plenty of space for his relatively little stuff, and a garage big enough to park his motorcycle and his pickup. The motorcycle didn't get used all that much these days, but a guy with his reputation was expected to have one. What woman didn't love hanging onto a pair of fine shoulders in a leather jacket? I wonder if Lanie would like that. He snorted to himself and put down the plate, long enough to pick up the can and take a sip, still staring out the window. Lanie would probably hate that, just like she hated everything else about him. She was another Weston sister. Actually, she was Athena's twin. He'd met her the same time Aaron had met Athena, at Seth's wedding to Arya. Blake had been dancing with some brunette. He thought she might have been the pastor's granddaughter or something, when he'd caught sight of Lanie Weston and had made a beeline straight for her. She had Arya's hair, and the ice blue eyes they all shared, and he'd hoped she'd be as fun as Artie was. She wasn't. It had been a long time since he'd met a woman he couldn't charm. That's pretty much all he was good at these days, but damn, Lanie Weston was stubborn. He hadn't even gotten his name out before she'd turned up her nose at him and declared she had to go fix her pantyhose. As she was dragging Athena out of the reception, presumably on the way to the ladies' room, Blake realized she was wearing pants. He had to laugh at that, but he could also respect his particular brand of charm wasn't for everyone. Sure wish it were though. Shaking his head, he took another sip. What was wrong with him? She was just one woman. One lady who wasn't charmed by him, when every other woman had fallen over themselves, trying to see if his reputation was true. Trying to climb into his bed and into his life. Guess that's what makes her special. With a sigh, he rolled the cold can across his forehead and frowned out the window again. Where was that pizza? You're not irritated we were messing with you, are you? At Wyatt's question, Blake whirled around and offered a wry grin to his boss. Nah, no worries. Just waiting on the delivery guy. Artie stood beside her husband, stealing chips off his plate. I think you should just cancel the pizza. Seriously, these nachos are amazing, and I'm stuffed. That's because you're teeny tiny. Wyatt pecked his wife on the cheek. Fun-sized. She rolled her eyes, her lips twitching. I am not. But thanks for that mental image. She grabbed a brownie from the tray Blake had made and plopped down in one of his kitchen chairs. But seriously, everyone out there is already talking about how full they are. It's true, Athena agreed, as she entered the room. Even Aaron says he's stuffed. When she smiled, she looked an awful lot like Lanie. Quit thinking about her, man. Athena joined her sister in munching on the dessert. Ew, these are good. Did you use organic cocoa? Don't tell me if you made them from a box mix. Powdered carob is so much healthier for you. Without giving anyone a chance to answer, she plopped down beside Artie. So, what are we talking about? Well, Wyatt was just insulting me. I called you fun-sized, he protested. And Blake was going to tell us why he's looking so glum. When Artie and Athena both turned, brows raised, Blake winced. No way in hell was he going to tell these two ladies he'd been thinking about their sister. And wondering how she kissed. Nothing, he blurted. I'm fine. Neither lady looked as if they believed that, but Wyatt saved his butt. I was about to ask him about Janet Richards. Janet Richards? Artie repeated thoughtfully. Isn't she the CEO of Big Dick's Pocket Sausage? She inherited the company from her father, didn't she? Wyatt was nodding. They're headquartered here in town, although they're sold all over the region. I like their organic hot dogs, Athena offered. Artie blinked in surprise. You do? Sure, it's not often I can find a commercially produced meat product that meets, my stringent organic requirements, but Big Dick's does. I like the way the meat nestles inside that pocket of delicious dough. Sometimes a gal just wants a long, thick, juicy sausage to wrap her lips around, and Big Dick's is always my first choice. Athena sighed happily. Her sister looked as though she were choking on her laughter, and Wyatt looked horrified. And Blake couldn't help but wonder if Lanie felt the same way about sausages as her twin. So, Artie's hand was over her mouth, eyes wide with glee, and her voice sounding a little choked as she steered the conversation back on track. What's Blake got to do with Janet Richards? Wyatt shook his head. He's going to seduce her. When both ladies looked shocked, Blake held up his hand to forestall their assumptions. Not actually seduce her. Hell yes you will, Wyatt countered. If that's what it takes. Man, I'm not a whore. Blake frowned at his boss, letting his irritation be known in his tone. Not even for the rodeo. What are you two talking about? Athena blurted. With a sigh, Blake ran his hand through his hair. We've gotten complaints about the quality of the food at the rodeo the last 2 years, yeah? Nothing big, but it's not anywhere near where it used to be. That's because, Wyatt explained, taking over the story, we had to start using pre-made stuff. When we lost our last vendor, Blake's been stuck driving to a restaurant supply place up in Helena and picking up a bunch of microwaved junk the high schoolers we hire can reheat and sell. Artie was nodding. And you want a contract with Big Dick's Pocket Sausage Company? An exclusive contract, Wyatt corrected. They don't currently have any contracts with the events in this area, and we're willing to offer them exclusivity. We'll only serve their dogs, sausages and buns and burgers, although we're going to keep the popcorn and nacho cheese supplier we currently have. And so Blake here has been assigned the task of sweet-talking Janet Richards? Blake sighed, and stepping away from the window, plunked his can down on the table. Wyatt decided I'm the man for the job. Was I wrong? His boss demanded. Everyone knows she's a cougar, really into younger guys, and we'd be dumb not to use that information. Since there's just the two of us in the office, and I'm married. Artie snorted. I suppose I should be thankful my husband isn't off seducing older women into his bed? Blake rolled his eyes. I'm not going to sleep with her. But. Wyatt lifted his brows. But. With another sigh, Blake reached for a brownie. I called her, and she's definitely interested. Pumping his fist, Wyatt hissed, yes. I guess your reputation gets around. Blake was thankful his mouth was full of brownie, so he didn't have to respond. Mainly because he didn't have anything he could say. So what's the plan? Wyatt prompted. Swallowing, Blake reached for his drink again. I'm taking her out next week. She's not in a hurry, and I figure I can close the deal pretty quick once I sit down with her. He was planning on a bottle of wine and a plate of lobster at that fancy seafood restaurant in town, and making Wyatt pay for it. If she's on board, I'll have the signed contract well before the rodeo, don't worry about it. Wyatt was beaming when he turned to his wife. See, sweetheart? I knew Blake would come through for us. But Artie just hummed, eyeing Blake in speculation. Are you sure you're okay with this? Blake forced an easy grin. Sure. It's what I do. Wine and dine the ladies, right? Wyatt was nodding, and Athena was engrossed in picking the brownie apart. What did she hope to find in there? But Artie continued to peer at him. In an effort to waylay whatever suspicion she might have, Blake gave her a thumbs up. I promise not to do anything I'm not comfortable with, okay? Not even for the rodeo. Not even for me? Wyatt protested. Definitely not for you. This time Blake's grin was genuine as he slapped his boss's shoulder. But I'm sending all the bills your way, man. Chuckling, Wyatt nodded agreement, and Blake knew it was his chance to make an escape. I'm going to go check if anyone else needs anything. Then, I'm going to call the pizza place. I mean it, ask around and see if anyone actually wants pizza, Artie called out. Maybe you can just cancel. He waved to let her know he'd heard, but didn't stop. As much as he liked Wyatt, Blake felt he needed to get away from his boss for a second. Maybe it was the reminder of what Wyatt expected of him, which, truthfully, wasn't all that bad. It wouldn't be the first time Blake had wined and dined an older lady to get what he wanted. Granted, usually what he wanted was a nice evening of fun conversation and laughter, but there was no reason he couldn't have that with Janet Richards. Even if it was heading for a sausage contract. Shaking his head, he scanned the living room, making sure everyone had enough food and looking for his phone. They'd used it earlier to keep track of scores during Jenga, hadn't they? Why was he being so defensive lately? His gaze landed on Seth and Arya, and he had to swallow down his irritation. Ah. That's it. His best friend, hell, half the people in his life, had recently fallen in love and gotten married. It was making him feel a little left out, frankly. He caught a glimpse of pale-faced rusty glaring daggers at Aaron and Athena, and wondered if she was feeling the same way. The idea of wining and dining a lady on his boss's dime, even for exclusive hot dog usage, just wasn't sounding as appealing as it used to. Why? Because of Lanie? Nah, that would be stupid. Not just stupid, but totally stupid. He'd only met the woman once, and she'd wanted nothing to do with him. So maybe not her. Maybe it's the idea of someone like Lanie being out there right now. Waiting. He snorted just as he spotted his phone on the coffee table. Someone waiting for him? A female out there, waiting for him? Sure, there were probably plenty of ladies who wanted a piece of him, but, glancing once more at Seth and Arya, he had to shake his head at his own foolishness. Thank goodness the doorbell rang at that moment and seemed to pop whatever melancholy balloon hung around him. He perked up. Pizza's here, he called. Seth groaned theatrically. I couldn't eat another bite. While Arya teased her husband, Rhodey drawled, I probably could. Bring em in. You could eat anything, Aaron snorted. It was good to see his friends all having fun, Blake thought, as he strolled around the coffee table to grab his wallet from the mantel. He'd paid online, but wanted to see if he had any cash for a tip. Shoot, he muttered, rifling through his wallet. It seemed as if no one used cash anymore these days. It seemed almost as if there were some kind of change shortage in America or something. Hey, he called over his shoulder, reaching for the front door. Any of you have any cash for? When he realized there wasn't anyone on the front porch, he bit off his words. His first thought was one of the neighborhood kids. There weren't many of them, but some of the hands had families, had played the old ding-dong ditch prank on him. But no, there was a car, kicking up dust as it sped off. Had the delivery person gotten the wrong pizza, or wrong house or something? Blake? Arya and Seth were standing behind him, and he followed Arya's finger to the plastic bin at the base of his porch stairs. What is that? Seth whispered. Blake shook his head, frowning, as he stepped out. I think, Arya said in a low voice, we're not getting pizza tonight. I'll start rounding everyone up. This is something Blake needs to deal with. What was she talking about? Through the still open door, Blake could hear his friends muttering to one another, but he wasn't paying them much attention. Instead, he squatted on the steps and reached into the bin. There was a bunch of stuff in it, mainly pink material and old plastic, toys? And was that a package of diapers? There was something else lumpy beside the bin, something covered in a white crocheted blanket with a big brown stain on it. But before he could reach for it, he noticed a manila envelope shoved into the bin. Figuring it might hold an explanation, he pulled it out and ripped it open. The top paper was a list, in handwriting he didn't recognize. No immunizations, who has time for that? Down to only 1 bottle a night for last 2 months, thank God, because the greedy little thing just did not let me sleep for the first 4 months. She likes mashed peaches and rice, but I'm not made of money. She's yours now, try not to screw her up any more than I would've, okay? This is me officially giving up my parental rights, or whatever. Good luck. You'll need it, Dad. It included a date from a few days back and a signature on the paper. He frowned in confusion and flipped to the next page. This he recognized as a birth certificate. What? His eyes scanned the page. Apple Blossom Littlelight. Was the kid, a girl apparently, related to him? Not a real common name even on the res. Birthdate was about 6 months ago, mother was listed as a Tolly Elliott, and the father was. Blake Littlelight. Someone had underlined it twice. Blake felt as if he couldn't breathe, there was a band around his chest, and he just couldn't seem to get in a good breath of air. He was listed as the father of this Apple Blossom? Who named a kid Apple Blossom? And then there was a little noise. A faint one he might not have noticed over the pounding of the pulse in his temples, except the stained blanket covering the lumpy thing moved. His vision already going black around the edges, Blake reached out and yanked the blanket from the lumpy thing, which turned out to be one of those baby car seats that became a carrier. There was a baby in it. A baby? Oh shit, there was a baby in it. It was a baby with pale hair and round cheeks and big serious blue eyes. Blue eyes a remarkably similar color to his own. The baby, it cooed at him. And suddenly, he was able to drag in a breath. Hands shaking, he reached out and turned the carrier, so the baby was facing him. Was this little Apple Blossom? The baby he supposedly fathered? Hey, little one, he murmured, remembering the letter in the strange handwriting. Giving up parental rights. Who would leave a baby on a doorstep in this day and age? The sun was sinking in the west, one of Montana's famous sunsets, painting the sky in vivid hues. Behind him, he could hear his friends talking in his home, and a soft breeze was blowing down his street, ruffling his black hair. But as the baby met his eyes, his world narrowed to just him and her. Tentatively, with shaking hands, he reached out and ran his forefinger across the back of one of her pudgy fists. The baby, Apple Blossom, made a little gurgling sound and waved her hand. He wasn't sure how it happened, but somehow, her little fingers ended up wrapped around his calloused forefinger, and she smiled. And Blake knew. He didn't know who Tolly Elliott was, and he had no idea how this baby came to be on his doorstep. But there was no way he was going to give her up. She was Apple Blossom Littlelight, and she was his. Chapter 2. Well, frankly, no, I'm not surprised, not even a little bit. Lanie put her car in park and reached for her phone, turning it off speaker and placing it against her ear as she eyed the cute little house in front of her. Arya said he didn't even realize what he was looking at. On the other end of the phone, her twin sister Athena snorted. Can you blame him? I mean, honestly? He was expecting pizza delivery, and the delivery turned out to be a baby. No wonder he was a little flabbergasted. Lanie rolled her eyes, not willing to give the man any more credit than she had to. If he had just managed to learn to keep it in his pants, this wouldn't be an issue. Yikes. She could hear her sister frown. What's up with the attitude? You don't like Blake? Didn't you only meet him once? Once was enough, Lanie muttered, as she watched the curtains in the little house for any signs of movement. The place looked quiet, but what did she expect? Blake Littlelight running around outside, naked, with a wench over his shoulder? Ridiculous. Reluctantly, her lips tugged upward at the thought. She had to admit, as little as she liked him, he was a fine-looking man, who probably looked even better shirtless. Lanie? She blinked. Arya told me about him, and I've heard the rumors, same as every other unmarried female within 4 counties. He's a slut. Her twin hummed, Can men be sluts? Is that a thing? I don't see why not. So you're slut-shaming? I thought that was passé these days. Strong independent women, taking charge of their sexuality, and all that. She hated it when Athena got all debatey. Well, if he were a woman, I'd support her, gah. Oh, it's double standard time then, eh? Lanie opened her car door with a bit more force than necessary. Shut up, Thena. Just pointing out your logical fallacies, sister dear. Athena said cheerfully. Now go, do good work. Oh, I will. Bye. Taking a deep breath, Lanie dropped her phone into her big purse, then hefted the thing over her shoulder. It carried all her paperwork, and even some medical equipment such as gloves and masks and hand sanitizer and trash bags. In her line of work, she never knew what she might need. She checked to make sure her ID was on the lanyard around her neck, then marched for the front door. It was mid-morning, and she was here on her way to another call. This one hadn't been an official call, which she had every intention of asking Mr. Blake Littlelight about. She rapped smartly on the door, then took a step back and braced herself. Okay, the man was hot. And not just like, kinda hot, but super hot. And he knew it too. He had high cheekbones and thick dark hair and gorgeous aqua eyes, which crinkled at the corners when he smiled. There'd been a moment as he'd approached her at her sister's wedding when she'd been totally gobsmacked. Then he'd introduced himself in that suave, smooth manner, and she'd recognized the name, and had then been disgusted with herself for even considering a man like him handsome. I mean, he's good-looking, fine, but he's not all that good-looking, right? He opened the door, and she realized she was totally wrong. He'd been hot that night at Arya and Seth's wedding. He might be hot normally. But in a pair of flannel PJ pants, a gray t-shirt, unshaven, holding a mug of coffee and a baby. Holy moly. Lanie knew she was staring. What woman wouldn't? And he was staring back at her in surprise, which slowly turned into delight. He was divine. He's a playboy who just got smacked with evidence of his womanizing by one of his baby mamas. Oh yes, that was a good reminder. She swallowed, straightened her shoulders, and frowned at him. Mr. Blake Littlelight? Lanie. Hi. How are you? Come on in. He stepped back, inviting her in with the coffee. Sorry, I'm a little, he glanced down at himself, he looks fine to me. No. Stop thinking like that, and offered a rueful smile. I'm not exactly prepared for guests, but I do have some fresh coffee if you'd like some. Fresh coffee sounded wonderful, if only to have something to do with her hands. But there was no way she was going to accept this man's hospitality. No, thank you, she made herself say, even as she stepped inside and let him shut the door behind her. His house was cozy. She knew her sisters and several others had been there the previous night for the group games they sometimes participated in, but it was hard to imagine so many people crammed into this cute little space. He was definitely a bachelor, but the place was well decorated and comfortable. It would have to be, because of all the women he's probably brought back here. He placed his coffee down on the dining room table and lifted his now empty hand to pat the baby's rump. She made a little cooing sound as he bounced her on his shoulder. He looked like a natural. So natural, in fact, it caused her to frown. Mr. Littlelight. Blake, please. He grinned charmingly. She frowned harder. Mr. Littlelight. I'm here as a representative of the county's Department of Social Services. You're a social worker? The man actually backed up a step, spreading his free hand to cover the baby's back protectively. Why are you here? Did he think she was going to hurt the baby? Mr. Littlelight, someone has to advocate for the child, and we received word. We? He shook his head, still looking, well, scared. Your sisters told you what happened last night? I didn't call anyone. Are the police involved? Did one of them call DSS? For the first time, she noticed the circles under his eyes and the way his shoulders slumped. He hadn't had an easy night, apparently. Well, it was just yesterday he found out he was a father and was handed a baby all at the same moment. He'll likely be pleased to get rid of her. With a sigh, Lanie let go of some of her defensiveness. Look, Mr. Blake. Time to talk to him on his level. I'm here to help. Arya and Athena told me what happened last night, and no, she didn't call DSS. I'm here, sort of off the clock. But if you just want to hand the baby over to me, I'll take care of the paperwork. What? This time he actually stumbled backward, knocking into the couch, and changed his legs to move them sideways along the couch, further from her reach. I'm not handing her over. What do you mean? The man looked terrified, and it confused Lanie, that was for certain. The baby lifted her head from his shoulder and began to fuss. Dada. Dada's here, Blossom, he muttered distractedly, patting her butt while still frowning at Lanie. I'm not going to let anyone take you away, no matter how pretty she is. Something in the vicinity of her heart squeezed when she realized he'd already accepted the baby's natural vocalizations of D sounds to stand for Dada, but then she scowled when she realized he'd called her pretty. He was trying to flirt with her? Now? Blake, this is what we do. If a baby is dropped off on a doorstep, we take her in and make sure she's loved. She's already loved. Before her ovaries had a chance to react to that perfect response, he hurried to ask, what would you do to her? To her? Lanie shook her head. You don't understand. I'm here to help. I can take her today, get her placed in a foster situation, with the hope of eventual adoption. There's no reason to think she couldn't find her forever home really quickly. But, he shook his head, blew out a breath, then looked down at the baby. She's mine. I know it was kinda odd the way I ended up with her, but I'm her father. The paper said so. Can you legally take her away from me? Oh no. Oh, no, she could feel her heart reacting to how darn lost he sounded. How worried. Was it possible she'd misjudged the situation? Did he really want to keep the baby? How long until he realizes he won't be able to keep up his usual philandering way of life? No matter what he said now, he'd want to give up that baby soon enough, she guessed. Listen, Mr. Blake, can I see the papers that were left with her? Nodding, he jerked his head, beckoning her to follow, though the wariness and uncertainty was still evident on his face. Da. I know, Cupcake, hold on. He darted into the kitchen and pulled something off the counter. To Lanie, he said, sorry, I was just waiting for her breakfast bottle to cool a bit. I've got all her stuff in her bedroom back here. Her bedroom? He'd already turned a space in his house over to her? Well, if he'd been up all night getting her adjusted, which is what it looked as if he'd been doing, it made sense he'd already. All the logic went out the window when she saw the second bedroom. There was a little daybed, for guests, and the rest of the space was filled with bookshelves, a dresser, and a small desk. Her brows went up when she saw his collection of books. He was quite the reader, wasn't he? On the bed, he'd arranged the bottom drawer of the dresser and padded it with towels. This was clearly where the baby slept. He nodded to the desk. Her birth certificate and the letter from her mom is there. Lanie picked up the certificate, but before she could glance at it, she saw him lift the bottle and squirt some of the formula into his own mouth. He smacked his lips a few times thoughtfully, then nodded. Cool enough, Blossom. You ready? The baby was kicking happily, throwing her head back from his shoulder and making those dada sounds again. He chuckled and settled down on the bed, propping one ankle on the opposite knee and resting her against his leg as he positioned the bottle. Catching her staring, he raised a brow in challenge. What? She started, then shook her head. Nothing. I've just never seen someone check the bottle temperature that way. It works. If it's too hot for me, it's way too hot for her. He was right. Where'd you learn so much about babies? Lanie asked, and she wasn't asking because of her job, she really was curious. He grinned. Oh, he had dimples. How had she forgotten the dimples? She forced her gaze down to the birth certificate, trying to make the words focus. I read a lot of articles. Why was her heart pounding so hard? And how come this certificate didn't make sense? Oh, it was because all of her attention was on him. Well, I was up all night, he admitted, and she could hear the shrug in his voice, researching, reading articles and watching videos on how to take care of a 6-month-old. That sure didn't sound like a man who wanted to get rid of an unwelcome baby. She glanced at him, but he was looking at his daughter. Taking a deep breath, she finally made the words on the paper focus, and she read them with a frown. Apple Blossom Littlelight? Hey, I didn't name her. But he'd started calling her Blossom. How cute was that? No. Not cute. Not charming. Bad Lanie. You're listed as the father, all right. Who is Tolly Elliott? Now she was reading over the letter the mother had left, and yes, it certainly looked like Tolly Elliott on the signature line, dated only a few days ago. When she realized he hadn't answered, she glanced at him again. He was still staring down at little Blossom, his expression seemingly to be somewhere between longing and worry. Blake? Who is Tolly? Just some lady, okay, he interrupted, those aqua eyes darting up to her, then back down. Well, that was offensive. He'd knocked the woman up and couldn't even remember her? Scowling, she pulled out her phone and snapped photos of both the birth certificate and the letter, just in case. In case what? In case he destroyed them, and she had to testify against him in court or something? This was stupid, it was obvious he wasn't ready to hand the baby over, and she wasn't there officially, not really. She straightened her shoulders and turned to face him, sliding the phone back into her purse. His eyes were now on her, narrowed, and full of suspicion. Why'd you do that? Because she didn't trust him. Taking a deep breath, she steeled her hormones against meeting his gorgeous eyes, and changed the subject. Mr. Littlelight, I do not doubt that baby is yours. Based mostly on what I know of your past. And as much as I think anyone would make a better parent than a philanderer like you. Ouch, he muttered, his brow lifting. It is clear this is your child, and as her father, you have a right to raise her. In his lap, the baby's legs kicked. He glanced down at her, then shifted Blossom into a better position so she could help hold her own bottle. He sure looked at ease with this parenting thing, didn't he? When he met Lanie's eyes again, his were even more serious. Finally, he inclined his head once. Thank you. She had to try one last time. You really don't want to give her up? Lanie, he shook his head, then dropped the level of his voice as he glanced down at the dark blue eyes staring up at him. I don't think I've ever wanted anything less. Giving her up, I mean. She's mine. His jaw hardened when he looked back up, as if daring Lanie to say different. I can take care of her just as well, if not better, than some foster family. I've already taken this week off to get us both settled, and we're good. I mean, we're good together. Blossom cooed up at her daddy, as if agreeing with him. Blake's voice dropped to a whisper as he focused all his attention on his daughter once more. She's mine, he repeated. Lanie sighed. Technically, this isn't a DSS matter. I would strongly urge you to call your lawyer, or find a lawyer if you don't have one, and get some legal protection. I don't know enough about the legal side, so I don't know if the letter from the mother is going to be enough to give up parental rights, if she ever decides she wants the baby back. But a lawyer can help you with all that. While she spoke, he stood, cradling little Blossom in the crook of his elbow and holding the bottle with his other hand. He looked, well, besides looking so damn domestic her heart clenched, he looked happy. Excited, suddenly, now that he knew she wasn't going to take the baby away from him. Which made her feel like an ogre. Wait a minute, I'm not the bad guy, am I? No, I'm not. He's the one who sleeps around and knocks up random women and doesn't even remember them. Of course, with a smile like that, it's no wonder. Focus. This isn't officially a DSS matter, Blake, but I'm going to check on her. Don't bother telling me not to, my sister is married to your best friend, so yeah, I'll be getting updates. Sure. He nodded and shifted his weight, and, oh my gosh, when has a man's bare feet ever looked so appealing? It probably had something to do with the flannel pants, tight shirt, and baby. You're welcome to stop by anytime, Blossom, and I would appreciate the company. Then he smiled down at the baby. Ain't that right, Cupcake? Lanie's ovaries clenched. Damn it. She forced a frown. I'll be checking on you too, Mr. Littlelight. Why's that? He turned his smile on her, the charming one, the one she knew lots of women had fallen for in the past. Don't you trust me? Nodding curtly, she turned on her heel. Not even a little bit. I'll see myself out. She did, and he didn't follow her, but once she reached her car, she tossed her bag onto the passenger seat and pulled her lanyard off from over her head, then dropped her forehead to the steering wheel. And she groaned. No matter how long she lived, she didn't think she'd ever forget the way his face had brightened when he'd recognized her. Or the way he'd looked, barefooted and mussed and unshaven, holding a baby. Or how damn in love he'd appeared when he'd looked at Blossom. It was her responsibility to make sure that baby was taken care of, and although she'd gone to his house fully expecting to leave with a new charge, she couldn't deny he seemed intent on raising her himself. He was in love with Blossom. And seeing that made it difficult not to like him. Just a bit. Yes, he was still a playboy who couldn't even remember his baby mama. But... don't you trust me? Not even a little bit, Blake. Well, maybe just a little bit. Chapter 3. Blake considered himself fairly intelligent. Sure, he was still slowly working his way through an online college degree, but he loved to read and was always learning new things. He knew parenthood was difficult. He understood the concepts, and felt he knew what to expect. But reading about it was entirely different from actually living it. The first week with Blossom in his life had been an epic blur. It had taken her 4 days before she settled back into the schedule Tolly's letter had mentioned, waking only once during the night around 2 for a bottle. Of course, by that time, Blake was halfway through his second book on the topic, thank goodness for his e-reader and books on demand, since the local library had inexplicably closed for who knows how long, and he was fairly certain he could get her trained to sleep through the night in just a few short weeks. Everything else might have been easier, if he'd been able to sleep those first 4 nights, but as it was, he caught most of his ZS in his recliner in the living room while she napped. This meant everything else was a little hazy, but he managed. The second day she was in his life, not long after Lanie had left, he'd felt confident enough to venture out to the store to buy a crib, one of those folding ones, which fit in his office for now, until he could remodel, and he also bought as much baby food as he could carry. He loaded up on the peaches and rice. The third day, he called daycares and lawyers, then spent the rest of the week touring facilities and meeting with his new legal counsel. Apparently, making Blossom legally his wasn't something which happened overnight, but he did manage to get her enrolled in a daycare by Monday morning, thanks to some friends pulling some strings for him. After his week's leave was over, he got to experience what real pain was. He and Blossom were finally in a groove, and he was happy to admit she had become the center of his whole life. He lived for the moment she recognized him, and her eyes lit up. Yeah, he knew her. Dada wasn't actually referring to him as her dad, but he figured if he just kept saying, "That's right, I'm Dada," eventually, she'd make the connection. And then, when he had to go back to work, he had to start dropping her off at daycare. It was a nice place, clean and cute. 2 of the Caudron triplets, the men who ran the ranch, had married educators, and another was married to a pediatric nurse, so Blake had been able to get plenty of good advice, along with a lot of cooing and declarations about how cute Blossom was. But no matter how great the place was, it really hurt to have to leave her there and drive away, knowing she was crying for him. He was willing to admit he sat in his truck there in the parking lot, tears in his eyes, and debating going back for her. But no, he had to work, even if it meant getting up a lot earlier than usual to get her ready, drive to town to drop her off, then drive back to the ranch. The rodeo wasn't going to plan itself, and Wyatt needed him. On his last day of time off, he called Janet Richards. "Hi, Janet. It's Blake Littlelight. Remember me?" "Well, hello there, Blake," she'd purred. "How could a girl possibly forget someone as handsome as you? What can I do for you?" Her throaty laugh told him her offer had sounded exactly the way she'd wanted them to sound. He'd swallowed, suddenly not liking the idea of taking her out. But they needed her contract. Luckily, they didn't need it right away, because he was wrapped up in Blossom at that moment. "I'm sorry to tell you that something's come up. Is there any way I can reschedule our lunch date?" "Of course, darling. Is everything all right?" At that moment, Blossom, who was playing on her gym mat on the floor, burbled happily, then pushed herself up, got her leg under her, and sat upright. Blake pumped his fist into the air and had to stop himself from shouting, "Good job, Cupcake." Instead, he'd cleared his throat, turned around, and tried to focus on the woman on the other end of the line. "Yeah, everything's fine, Janet. Just a little hiccup on scheduling on my end. Totally my fault, and I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. How does lobster sound?" When he named the seafood restaurant, she'd hummed thoughtfully, "Blake, darling, you are single, aren't you?" Further proof she wasn't interested in a business date. "Yep, single. That's me. I don't really do relationships." "Yes, I've heard that about you." She'd chuckled throatily again, and he could easily guess why the news had appealed to her. "Except, I thought I just heard a baby?" "Shit." Stepping into the kitchen, he'd thought fast. He had no interest in whoring for the rodeo, or his boss. But they needed this contract. And the person who could determine if they'd get the contract was a woman who very much, apparently, wanted to date Blake. Well, she wanted a lobster at least. He could handle a lunch lobster. If she thought he was in a relationship, if she realized he had a kid, what would that do to the contract negotiations? Would she shut them down before he could even get started? He needed her to think he was available. Available for whatever she had in mind, even if he wasn't really. So he'd smiled and drawled out a lie. "I had the television on. Sorry, babe, I turned it down now. So we're cool with another day?" "I look forward to it, Blake. I'll email you my calendar." "Great. Thanks again." "Absolutely, darling. Oh, and Blake? Don't fool with me on this. I would not be happy about that." He wasn't certain how he managed to sign off and hang up. "You are single, aren't you?" "Well, not really. Not anymore. Now he and Blossom were a pair, weren't they? And you wouldn't mind someone else in your little mix, would you?" He'd had to chuckle at himself then. Because he was still thinking about Lanie Weston. The woman who'd dismissed him so thoroughly at Seth's wedding, and who then had shown up at his house and made it perfectly clear what she thought of him. She'd called him a philanderer, which was only a word he knew from some of his more old-fashioned books. He figured it was nicer than calling him a man-whore or a slut, which is probably what she really thought of him. Yeah, Lanie didn't want anything to do with him. So how come he was fussing so hard over dinner tonight? She was stopping by on her way home from work to check up on Blossom. That was what her text had said, and he figured he should be grateful she'd given him the heads up. It was probably in her best interest to just drop by unannounced and try to catch him rolling around in rat feces or feeding the baby cardboard or something. But instead, she was going to get a batch of his famous spaghetti. Okay, not famous, but it would be famous if anyone knew about it. The doorbell rang a little after 5. It was still early for dinner, but he didn't want to risk her finding a reason not to stay, so he'd started cooking as soon as he'd gotten home and taken his shower. The scent of baking garlic bread now filled the house, and he wiped his hands on a hand towel, which he threw over his shoulder, as he dodged Blossom's toys on the way to the front door. "Hey there." To his surprise, his big smile wasn't the least bit faked, and it definitely wasn't the one he used when charming women. No, this one was just him being happy to see Lanie. "Come on in." He didn't miss the tentative way she stepped into the house, or the way she peered suspiciously around the living room, and at him. Unable to stop himself from teasing her, he spread his arms. "Like what you see." She made a little snorting noise and looked away. "Glad to see you managed to get out of your pajamas at least. For you, Lanie, I'd get in or out of PJs anytime." He winked, she blushed, and he felt like an idiot. Why in the hell are you still trying to charm this woman? But it had been the truth. Usually by the time he got home, got Blossom set up in one of her bouncers and got himself into the shower, he threw on his flannel pants and a ratty t-shirt and spent the rest of the evening in comfort. Not that those were his pajamas, because in actuality, he slept naked. But tonight, he'd found a clean pair of jeans and a button-up shirt just for her. He was even wearing boots. "Yeah, you're definitely trying to charm her." Flustered now, when was the last time he'd gotten flustered around a woman? Blake turned and gestured for her to follow him into the kitchen. She took her time. "Wow, you've really gone all out, huh?" At the door, he turned to see her surveying all the stuff he'd picked up for Blossom over the last week. Some were garage sale or online marketplace finds, but he'd also spent a bundle at the big store in town. There was one of those jumpy things hanging in the doorway to the hall, he'd researched, and had found this one was the safest option. He'd also gotten a bouncer to help her develop her leg muscles and balance, and a seated bouncer for when he just needed to put her down, and a baby gym, which he suspected she was already too big for. And spread all over the floor were her rubber blocks and stuffed animals. "Yeah," he admitted with a shrug, shoving his hands in his pocket, "we both like to play." She shot him a look he couldn't interpret. Was she surprised he liked to get down on the floor and play with Blossom? That's how he'd spent each evening so far, after all. "So, where is she? Napping?" "Nah, she's down to about 2 naps a day, although sometimes she does conk out on the way home from daycare, but that's just a cat nap." He jerked his chin. "She's behind the couch. Hear her?" Sometimes it seemed as if Blossom's constant burbling was just background noise, and he wondered what that boded for the future. He was picturing a preteen who would be talking constantly on her phone. But then he'd make himself slow down and take a breath, and just get through the current week. Or sometimes, at 3 a.m. the next hour. Besides, there was always the possibility if someone, like the Department of Social Services, found out the truth, he wouldn't be Blossom's father for much longer. Lanie had stepped around the couch, and he saw her brows go up. "You made this for her?" He knew what she was looking at, a sort of playpen he'd constructed. He'd gotten the idea from a video, and it was easy enough to put down a clean rug and use the existing furniture to block off a space. He'd bought a bunch of pool noodles to shove under the couch and credenza so she couldn't squeeze under, and he'd blocked off anything dangerous. "Sure," he said, with another shrug. "She likes to roll around, and it's handy to have someplace to let her go nuts while I'm cooking." He pointed to a camera he'd set up on the lamp. "The monitor lets me keep an eye on her. Right now, she's working on pushing herself upright. She can sit unassisted for a little while." "I can see that," Lanie murmured, her expression inscrutable as she watched the baby. "This is really... I can see you've done your homework. It's not hard. There's about 1 million websites out there with advice on how to take care of a 6-month-old. I just have to figure out which one I trust. That's basically all I do once I put her down for bed. Just scroll through sites, looking for help." When she glanced at him, he swore he saw something much like surprise, and maybe even respect, in her pale blue eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a bun, but he'd seen it down at the wedding and knew it was a little past her shoulders. Today, she wore a gray pantsuit with a lacy black blouse under it. It was totally severe and distinguished and professional. Blake wanted to peel it off, piece by piece. With his teeth. When his desire flared, maybe something showed in his face, because she suddenly blushed and looked back down. Just in time, apparently. Whoops, she blurted, just as Blossom let out her frustrated cry. But before the baby could really start, Lanie kicked off her sensible shoes and stepped into the little play area to scoop up his daughter. There we go, she crooned, bouncing a little as she settled Blossom against her chest. That wasn't so bad, was it? Sitting up is hard, but you're doing such a good job, aren't you? The baby stopped fussing, probably out of surprise, and stared at this new person. Blake liked the way Blossom had a habit of studying new things with a really intense stare, before deciding if she was going to laugh or cry about them. Right now, she was subjecting Lanie to that same stare. And Lanie just smiled softly back. You're a pretty little thing, aren't you? I guess you would be, with your father. She bit off whatever she was going to say, but he swore her cheeks got even pinker. And all that blonde hair, huh? His jeans were already tight, thinking about peeling all those clothes off her, but seeing Lanie holding his daughter like that, seeing how gentle and caring she was, seeing her concern, and seeing how damn natural she looked, Blake's chest got tight too. My mom was a blonde, he managed to choke out, knowing it was irrelevant. Still bouncing the baby, she raked him from head to foot with a look. He knew what she saw. He was a quarter Crow Indian and had his grandfather's dark hair. But his grandmother and mother both had blue eyes, so that's where he got his. And he was going to claim that's where Blossom got them too, if Lanie questioned him. She didn't. Instead, she hummed and raised a brow, then smiled down at the baby. Are you hungry, little one? She crooned. Smells like your daddy is cooking dinner for you. For us, he blurted, then tried to remember how to be charming. Oh yeah, start with a smile. I mean, I knew you'd be stopping by, so I made enough for you to join us. Oh, no, Mr. Littlelight, I couldn't. Blake. Please, he reminded her. And you'd be helping me out if you stayed to eat. I want Blossom to see meals aren't always just me and her. Besides, the garlic bread's about to come out of the oven, and I made way too much for just me and her. He could see she was wavering. Well. Please, Lanie? Join us for dinner? Just then, the timer went off for the bread, and Blossom began to kick happily and burble again, and Lanie sighed. Fine, she said, with a little eye roll. But then she smiled softly and met his eyes. But just because it sounds like you need me. He smiled in return. You have no idea how much I need you. And she probably never would. Chapter 4. So, it turned out Blake Littlelight was a darn good chef. Probably part of his arsenal of seduction. Wine and Italian food is very sensual, you know. Mentally, she scoffed at her inner skeptic. Lay off. Maybe he just likes to cook. But it was hard to deny he was flirting, and he was being charming. Of course, he's like that to the baby too. Maybe that's just his personality, flirtatious and charming. Whose side are you on, anyhow? I'm on your side. Just trying to keep you from making hurtful assumptions. Oh, great. Now she was arguing with her inner monologue. Did that make it an inner dialogue? Lanie snorted softly into her Caesar salad. Everything all right? Her attention jerked back to the gorgeous hunk of eye candy sitting across from her, looking worried. Oh, yeah, she hurried to assuring him, putting the fork back down and reaching for her water. This is delicious. His expression faded to relief, and when he did eventually smile, it looked shy. Dimples. We have a code red. Dimples, I repeat, dimples. Heart is speeding up, ovaries are making their wishes known. Code red. Stupid inner monologue. My grandfather taught me to cook when I was young. Spaghetti was one of his favorites. It's really good. She glanced at Blossom. I'm not the only one who thinks so. He chuckled. Nah, she's not actually eating it. Blossom just likes rubbing the food on her face, don't you, Cupcake? The 6-month-old burbled happily and slammed her plastic spoon against the tray. She was wearing only a diaper, a bib, and at least a quarter cup of spaghetti pieces. Her father, it was impossible to think of him as the guy who'd found a baby on his doorstep, when it was so obvious how much he liked being a father, had mixed some sauce and noodles together, then cut up the noodles into half-inch pieces. With her free hand, Blossom was doing her best to get her fingers to cooperate and pick up the tiny pieces, then trying to get them into her mouth. Her intensity was hilarious and adorable all at once. "How's she doing on picking up small objects like that?" Blake grinned, tearing apart a piece of garlic bread. "According to what I've read, she's right on track. I'm waiting on the lawyer to get back to me, but I've already got a pediatrician picked out. I'm taking her to the place where Bobby Caudron, Decker's wife, works." He popped the garlic bread into his mouth. But she noticed he then flicked his 2 fingers into the air, and her brow went up. There was a stupid superstition in town about the Caudron cousins, 2 sets of triplets, born within a week of each other, bringing bad luck. Her sister Artie, who was married to one of the cousins, had told Lanie all about it and how the townspeople thought they could ward off bad luck by licking their fingers and putting them in the air whenever the name was mentioned. "Don't you work for the Caudrons? Wyatt, Artie's husband, is your boss, right?" "Yep. He's in charge of the racetrack, and I'm his right-hand man. I do a lot of the legwork for the annual rodeo." And yet, she flicked her fingers into the air, raising a brow. He just looked confused. "When you mentioned Decker Caudron, you did the thing." "What thing?" Blake frowned. Although knowing it was bad manners, Lanie plopped her elbows on the table and laced her fingers in front of her chin. "Blake, I need to tell you that I'm an intelligent, learned woman who doesn't believe in jinxes and superstitions." "Learned? As in 2 syllables? Not just learned." He whistled, reaching for his glass. "That means a college education, at least, eh?" "Well, yes. I can tell the difference between a verb and an adjective." He offered a salute with the glass. "And for words which can be either, you pronounce the ed on adjectives, like learned woman." Blossom banged her spoon against her tray. "Dad Ada." While Lanie blinked in surprise at his words, Blake didn't lose a beat in switching his attention to the baby. "No, Blossom, you can't have water yet. But yes, you can grow up to be a learned woman, if you'd like." Blossom screeched, laughed loudly, then smashed spaghetti onto the top of her head, before resuming her banging on the tray. When Blake glanced back at Lanie, he winked. "I'll bet you didn't expect me to know that, did you, Miss Learned Woman?" She opened her mouth, but it took 2 tries before she could make her voice work. "I confess, you're surprising me at every turn. The spaghetti really was good. Did you study English in school?" "Nope," he declared cheerfully, his attention on his noodles. "My dad and grandfather consider themselves intellectuals, and are both still irritated I didn't go to college. But the money wasn't there anymore, and I've been working through an online degree for a while now." He glanced up and grinned. "At this rate, I figure I should have a bachelor's degree by the time I'm 30, but I'm not sure how much good it'll do me. I don't really need the degree, and I know I'm going to keep reading no matter what." Yes indeed, he was surprising her at every turn. "I also like to read," she confessed. "Sometimes my sisters tease me because I don't really care for novels." "Nope. All nonfiction for me." "I do like biographies though," he confessed, as if it were a failing, "but I think history's my favorite." Remembering all those books in his spare bedroom, she felt herself grinning. "What's your favorite era?" They spent a few minutes swapping book recommendations before he cleared his throat. "So was there any specific reason why you suddenly declared yourself a learned woman, who doesn't believe in superstition?" "Was there?" "Oh, yeah. You did the thing." Blake leaned forward, his fork dangling lazily in his hand, and lowered his voice. "Lanie, I still don't know what the thing is." She felt herself blushing as she lifted 2 fingers into the air. "When you mentioned Decker Caudron, you tried to ward off evil." Proving he could surprise her yet again, Blake flushed. In embarrassment? He placed his fork down and reached for the napkin in his lap. "Oh, that." He shook his head. "I know it's stupid, and Seth gives me a hard time about it. Old habits die hard and all that. My grandfather, again, a medically educated man, was raised on the reservation. He used to say that twins shared a soul, each getting half. So triplets only get a third of the soul each and are bad luck. And so licking your fingers and sticking them in the air wards off the bad luck? Look, I know it's not true. I'm working on it, alright? Slowly, she grinned, then shook her head and dropped her attention to her noodles. He was actively working towards self-improvement, and she couldn't help but like that. You can't help but like a lot of things about him, Shut up. He's probably just being charming. You're being cynical. Great. Now her inner monologue was insulting her. So, you know I work for the Cauldrons. How about you? He hurried to clarify. I mean, I know you're a social worker, but, I guess I shouldn't ask you what you really do, huh? She winced, knowing if she explained, it would ruin the meal. Still, he'd asked. I'm an advocate for the kids who don't have advocates. Kids who need someone to look out for their best interests. Her gaze flicked to Blossom, but it was impossible to deny the baby was happy in her new life. Whether that means reuniting them with their parents, or finding new homes for them. Tolly gave up her parental rights, Blake was quick to remind her, so that means. Well, if you did decide, for whatever reason, that I wasn't the right person to raise Blossom, he was staring down at his almost empty plate, his voice sounding bleak. What would happen? She knew she shouldn't have explained. And why did it hurt so much to know she'd been the one to make him sound so bleak? I suppose I, or the office, not necessarily me, would remove her from your home and find a placement for her. But I'm just as good as a foster parent, aren't I? When he met her gaze, there was desperation in his eyes. I could get certified as a foster parent or whatever. I could get her back? His name was on the birth certificate. He was this child's father. She took a deep breath and admitted the truth to him. Blake, I came here last week, and tonight, to check on her. Not officially, but to make sure she didn't need an outside advocate. His expression was part worry, part desperation, waiting for her to finish. From what I've seen so far, I think you're doing a good job with her. You're just as good as a foster parent. She wanted to yell it, but her earlier irritation at him held her back. He was doing a good job with Blossom, but for how long? Until he realized the baby would likely stand in the way of his next romantic conquest? Until he realizes you want to be the next romantic conquest, and you don't mind the baby at all. Holy guacamole, where had that thought come from? Hi, it's us, your ovaries. Just a natural reaction to seeing a fine-looking man holding a baby, we assure you. Huh. Her inner monologue had turned into an inner dialogue, then an inner conversation. It took a moment to realize he hadn't responded, and when she glanced up at him, he was grinning, his plate now empty. What? He swallowed. I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, Lanie Weston. Yeah, well, the bar wasn't set all that high. When Blake started laughing, Blossom joined in, and Lanie couldn't help chuckling as well. After dinner, she helped him hurry through loading the dishwasher. She knew she should make her excuses to leave, he'd only invited her for dinner, after all, but she wouldn't be a very good guest if she didn't help clean up, right? Now who's making excuses? So you're basically the one who runs the Caudron Valley rodeo, huh? She asked, as she wiped down the table. Little Blossom was clearly no longer interested in her food and was chewing on her bib. There was sauce and a good portion of noodles in her hair, and Lanie understood now why the baby was basically naked. It was to save her clothes from ruin. Behind her, Blake was rinsing the plates. Well, I don't run it, but yeah, Wyatt relies on me for a lot. It's a big event. It certainly is. She stacked the placemats under the napkin holder. What kind of man had placemats? Her brothers certainly didn't. We come in from Black Aces for it each year. You do? He sounded so surprised, she waited to answer until she crossed back to the counter and shook the dish rag into the sink. Sure. It's a lot of fun. I mean, we missed the year you had to cancel because of that weird illness a few years ago. Remember how everyone went around wearing masks all the time to protect each other? He shuddered. Oh yeah, that stunk. I'm glad we were able to go back to normal not too long after that, well, except the food. When he whipped around to face her, she shrugged. The food started going downhill after that, no offense. He exhaled, and it was clear he wasn't telling her everything when he said a little too quickly, we're working on that. We're working on that. Dad Ada. Brrrr. Ada Dad. His awkwardness faded when he called to the baby, alright, Blossom, hold on. I know you're ready to squirm, we're almost done here. Are you going to let her play like that? Lanie asked, with raised brows. Nah, I'm going to bathe her. I'd ask you to help, but I don't want you to ruin your nice suit. Pshaw. Without looking at her, he grinned and shoved the last of the silverware in the dishwasher. I don't think you're supposed to say "shaw" out loud, Lanie. I think it's just a sound you make. Don't laugh, I learned most of my conversational tactics from books. He was outright chuckling when he began to wash out the sink, and that made her grin. Since his back was to her, she felt comfortable shrugging out of her suit jacket and slinging it over the same chair back she'd hung her purse and lanyard on. The black blouse she wore was fancy, but at least it wasn't dry clean only like the jacket. Especially when it came to spaghetti sauce. And she had every intention of helping bathe the baby. Hey there, Blossom, she murmured, trying to figure out how to unsnap the buckles holding the baby into the high chair. Give me a minute to figure out this rocket science. It's not rocket science, he called from the sink, humor still in his voice. It is when they're covered in sauce. Ah. Got it. She had enough sense to remove the baby's bib before pulling Blossom out of the chair, and also making sure to hold her at arm's length as she carried the little one to her father. Just plunk her right in there, Blake said, with a nod to the now empty sink. We tried spaghetti last week and learned from our mistakes, didn't we, Cupcake? When he cooed at the baby, Blossom beamed. As Lanie was trying to figure out how to get the diaper off, turned out that sauce-covered babies were slippery. Blake grabbed a towel and some no-tears soap. He slid in next to Lanie by the sink and reached under her arms to deftly pull the diaper tabs apart. His shoulders brushed against hers, and though it was just a moment, it was enough. It felt right. It felt right to be standing here next to him, still smiling over their last teasing encounter and working together toward a common goal. Too right. Quickly, she passed the baby off to Blake and reached for the dish rag again. Better to put some space between them, and that high chair wasn't going to clean itself. While she scrubbed, spaghetti sauce got everywhere, her attention was on the pair at the sink. She smiled when she heard him lose his patience. Blossom, no, I told you that wasn't for eating. And loved the way the baby seemed to answer him as if she were giving him her own scolding. To her surprise, she found the tray was able to be removed completely from the high chair. Whoops. What? He asked, his back still facing her. Nothing. I just found more spaghetti sauce. I can't believe you went out and bought her a high chair. From behind, his shrug did all sorts of interesting things to his muscles. It converts, he called out. I thought that was cool. So when she's older, she can sit at the table with me. He was thinking about the future. He'd gone all out when it came to baby-proofing his home and making Blossom happy, not just with all the stuff, but the way he was learning about childcare too. This man was clearly thrilled to be a father and was taking his responsibility seriously. But what will happen when he decides he's done? She frowned down at the now reddish-orange tinted dish rag. Would he decide that? This was the longest time she'd spent with him, and, she had to admit, he wasn't what she'd expected. He was trying to better himself, and he wanted what was best for the baby. He didn't seem like the self-absorbed charmer he'd appeared to be at Aria's wedding. If she'd misjudged him about his intentions with Blossom, was it possible she'd misjudged him in other areas as well? He doesn't care about Tolly Elliott, the baby's mother. That much was obvious from the beginning. Either he doesn't remember her, or he does, but she means nothing to him. Lanie swallowed, and for the first time acknowledged a hard truth. She was jealous of this Tolly Elliott. She was jealous of a woman who'd been nothing more than a one-night stand to the sexy, charming, gorgeous Blake Littlelight. She was jealous, because she wanted that too. What? No. No, I do not want to be a one-night stand, thank you very much. Okay, Blake called, all done, and Lanie jerked out of her confused thoughts. She hurried to clean off the dish rag, and to her surprise, Blake handed her the blanket-wrapped baby as soon as she was done. Hold her for me for a sec, will you? I'll go grab her clothes. And Lanie was stuck holding the cherub again. Just like the moment she'd picked up Blossom in the living room, her heart clenched as the little girl stared up at her. Duh? No, Cupcake, Lanie whispered, I'm not your dada. He'll be right back. Blossom's serious blue eyes, a little lighter than Blake's aqua, searched Lanie's face, so Lanie tried a smile. It didn't work. Instead, the baby frowned, then reached up and grabbed for the small pearl earrings Lanie wore. Whoops, let's not do that. Lanie hurried to shift the baby and handed her an empty bottle from the drying rack to occupy her hands. Blossom took it, but didn't quit her study of the woman holding her. Lanie took the moment to study Blossom in return. She had the cutest little round cheeks, and the bath had left her blonde hair darker and spiky. It was impossible to resist the urge to lift the sweet little girl and brush a kiss across her cheek. When Blossom didn't resist, Lanie did it again. And again. All while trying to ignore the way her ovaries were jumping up and down and yelling, Yippee, a baby! We're holding a baby at last. Then, smiling, she blew a raspberry against Blossom's neck, and the little girl burst into high-pitched laughter. It sounded so good. I don't think I'll ever get tired of that. Blake's voice startled her, and Lanie looked up to see him leaning against the door jamb, staring at the two of them. And that stare of his reached deep down into her stomach and pulled. Her laughter? Lanie asked in a choked voice, trying to distract herself. Blake wasn't looking at the baby though. He held her gaze intently, and she saw the heat in it. Yeah, he drawled, and she knew it was a lie. He's a philanderer. He's just trying to charm you into his bed. Would that be so terrible? Of course it is. You don't want to be just another notch on his bedpost, do you? Did guys really do that? Or was that just a narrative convention perpetrated by confused authors? Hi, it's us, your ovaries again. Just wanted to chime in and let you know we're totally on board with the being charmed into bed thing. She was pretty certain the sound which came out of her mouth sounded something like, arg, as she thrust the towel-wrapped baby into his arms. He juggled Blossom and the clothes he was holding, until thrusting the latter at her. Here. For you. Confused, she held up a cute pair of footed jammies, not nearly as cute as the ones Arya made, then backpedaled across the room. Thanks? No, not the PJs, you can bring those back here, he said with a grin, as he laid Blossom out on the counter and reached for a diaper. The shirt's for you. It's one of mine. It's definitely clean, don't worry. She got some spaghetti sauce on yours. Lanie frowned down at herself, and sure enough, there was a smudge of red at her hem. It's fine, I'll take care of it. You don't want it to set. You can change in the powder room, and I'll go ahead and treat it and wash it here. You can wear my t-shirt until then. Her fingers clenched around the blue cotton he'd handed her and unconsciously brought it to her nose. It smelled like him. She imagined taking her shirt off. She imagined sliding into the soft cotton and being enveloped by his scent. She imagined sitting with him on his couch, maybe having another drink, laughing as they watched Blossom play and talking about nothing much at all. It sounded amazing, which is why she couldn't stay. No, thank you, she choked out, stumbling for her jacket and purse. Dinner was really good, thank you. But I have to go. She had to get out of here before she threw herself at him, like one of his conquests. She had to get out of here before she started to fall in love with him. He was frowning, confused, one hand protectively on the baby's belly. Lanie dropped the jammies on the counter next to Blossom and nodded. Thank you, she muttered, yet again, then made her escape. She was halfway home before she realized she was still holding his shirt. And despite knowing it was a terrible idea, she slept in it that night. And dreamed of him. Chapter 5. Blake was flat on his back on the floor, his knees bent and his bare toes digging into the plush rug he'd gotten for Blossom. He held his phone above his head, frowning at it. No matter how many times he'd checked it in the last week, it hadn't changed. The text conversation he'd started with Lanie after she'd run out of the house last week still only had one comment in it, and thus, wasn't really a conversation. "Lanie, I had a great time tonight with you. Blossom did as well. Thanks for joining us for dinner. I hope to see you again soon." It was stilted and awkward, but at the time, he'd figured it was better than writing, "OMG, why'd you run away, we were having the best time, come back," which is what he'd been tempted to type. Also, she still had his shirt. Ada dada. As he dropped the phone beside him, a baby butt smacked into his ear. He turned in time to catch a mouthful of diaper and sat up grinning. "Cupcake, you're going to be crawling soon, aren't you?" Blossom hit him with a toy hammer. "Ada dada. Brrrbb. Dada." Chuckling, he scooped her up and held her over his head, airplane style. "That's right, Blossom. I'm Dada." At least, he would be, as soon as his lawyer finished up the legal stuff. "Did you have fun today at school?" The baby was laughing, which caused a big drop of drool to slip out of her mouth. "Whoops." Blake lowered her to his chest, catching the drool on his shirt, instead of his nose. Rolling them both to the side, he propped himself up on his elbow and picked up one of her blocks. "Want to know how my day went? I spent 3 stinking hours at that business lunch with Janet Richards." He stacked the red block on top of the blue one. "Wanna know a secret? I don't think she was that interested in talking business, from the way she kept rubbing my leg with her foot." It had been awkward, but Blake had done his damnedest to be charming, and kept steering the conversation back to the contract, which Janet had taken with impatience. "Dad?" The baby grabbed hold of the waist of his flannel pants and pulled herself up. "That's right, she's after your dada." He sighed and shifted so Blossom could get a better grip. "I think she was disappointed our lunch date meant she couldn't find a reason to get me a hotel room for the night, then join me. Which is why, apparently, our next business meeting is going to be over dinner." Janet Richards was older than him, sure, but she was a beautiful woman. And smart, and successful, and witty, all things he liked in his evening companions. So why was the thought of spending an evening with her so icky? He sighed. "Heck, I've been a dad for 2 weeks, and even my internal monologue has stopped using naughty language." It was because of Lanie. No, not the inner monologue thing, the Janet thing. He didn't want to spend time with Janet, contract or not, because he was thinking about Lanie. "Who ran out of here and hasn't even bothered to text you back?" He glanced at the phone just before Blossom plopped down on her butt again. "Adada mamama." She said mama. Chuckling, he picked up the yellow block and stacked it atop the other 2. "I know the M sound is as natural as the D sound when it comes to language development, but I'm going to take that as a good sign, okay?" In response, Blossom knocked over his tower. "That's okay, Cupcake. Cause and effect is part of learning." Too bad he didn't know what he'd done to cause the effect of Lanie running out of here. And he still wasn't sure what to do about Janet and the damn contract. In exasperation, he rolled over onto his back once more and groped for his phone. With one eye closed to protect himself from the hammer his daughter had picked up once more, he held the phone up. There was a text message. From Lanie. He couldn't click the icon fast enough, and then their conversation, because it was officially a conversation now, opened. "Can I stop by?" Judging from the way Blossom burbled in response, Blake had made some sort of noise, probably a gleeful yodel or something. But he tried to keep calm as he typed. "Sure. Sounds." He was interrupted mid-invite by his daughter, who chose that moment to pull herself up by his hair, then throw herself across his face. She ended up straddling his throat, and Blake hoped the "sounds great" he typed by feel actually went through. Grinning up at Blossom, who was mere inches away from his face, he managed in a strangled voice, "Guess we better start cleaning up, Cupcake." "Ada?" There was a knock at the door. Blake's brows shot up, and he twisted to pull his phone into focus. He'd written "sounds go what" in his last message, surely she hadn't read that when she was already on his front porch. With one thumb, he typed, "What? You mean now," and tried not to suffocate on his daughter's belly. There was laughter from the direction of the front door, which he only heard because it was now open. He leaned his head back as far as it would go to see behind him, and from his angle, Lanie appeared upside down as she poked her head in. He'd never seen anything so beautiful. "Knock, knock?" Smiling, he managed a strangled, "Who's there?" Even upside down, her grin made his heart race. "Me," she said, stepping out of her shoes and closing the door behind her. "Me who?" She leaned over and picked up Blossom. "Tell your father I'm not doing a knock-knock joke with him." Blossom burbled a dada, and hit Lanie on her forehead with the hammer. Blake had rolled over to his side, about to push himself up and join the ladies, when Lanie surprised him by sinking gracefully down to the rug beside him, sitting cross-legged and resting the baby between her legs. She was wearing a pair of those fancy dress slacks, and a blouse with flowers on it, and looked good enough to eat. Or maybe it was just because she was sitting on his living room floor. He wished he'd made dinner again. So, Blake cleared his throat, feeling a little silly lying on the floor, but when Blossom pushed herself out of Lanie's hold and began to scoot towards him, he stayed where he was. "How was your day?" It sounded awkward, but he was pretty sure, "Why are you here?" would sound even worse. Apparently, it was the right thing to ask. Her shoulders slumped a little as she relaxed. Well, it wasn't great. I didn't want to bother you, but I realized I could really use some baby cuddles to make me feel better, so. "Hey," he said softly when she trailed off. She glanced at him, and he smiled. "Blossom and I are always here if you need cuddles. I mean baby cuddles. Although, if you really want grown-up cuddles, I'll just stop talking." She smiled. "Deal." "Thanks, Blake." This was the 4th time he'd seen her in person, and she was already calling him Blake. Heck, she was sitting on his rug, playing with his baby. That had to count for something. While Blossom scooched over to him on her belly, Lanie stacked 2 blocks. "I really am sorry for bursting in without warning." "Lanie," he interrupted, catching and holding her gaze, "I've been staring at my phone for a week, praying you'd reach out. I can't describe how glad I was to get your message." "Ah, yes. That's why you wrote it'd be good to see me," she teased with a grin. And he grinned back, rolling up to a seated position. "I was right, wasn't I? It is good to see you. You want anything to eat?" "No, thank you," she said softly, turning the blocks over in her hands. She exhaled. "Can I play for a few minutes?" "You can play for a few hours if you'd like. Our calendar is open for the rest of the night." She grinned at his silly joke and placed the 3rd block on top of the other 2. Just like before, Blossom waved her hammer at them, knocking all 3 apart. "That's okay, little one," Lanie said, scooping them all back up, "that's part of learning. Do you want to try?" She handed Blossom one of the blocks. The baby quickly tossed it aside, and caught Blake grinning at her. "What?" "Nothing," he drawled, shaking his head. "It's just, I said the same thing to her, not 10 minutes ago. We were talking about cause and effect and my job." "And did she answer you?" "She sat on my face and tried to suffocate me, then attempted to strangle me, which you were witness to when you walked in. I think she got tired of my lectures." Chuckling, Lanie scooped up the baby and blew a raspberry on her neck. "Were you trying to murder your dada?" Dada. That's right, he's a talker, isn't he?" "Amamad." Giggling again, Lanie tickled Blossom's belly, and the baby laughed along with her. And Blake didn't think he'd ever seen anything more wonderful. Lanie ended up staying for dinner. How could she not, when Blake held Blossom up next to his face and made it sound as if the baby said, "Please. It's just tuna salad sandwiches, but Dada needs company who can speak real English." Laughing, she agreed. Besides, tuna salad sandwiches with these 2 sounded better than peanut butter and jelly in her own apartment, which was the plan otherwise. The 2 of them had an easy dinner, while Blossom tried to pick up Cheerios from her highchair tray. The adults swapped stories about the best on-demand history documentaries they'd seen recently. And this time, instead of letting her help clean up, Blake handed her Blossom and a baby bottle. "If you want to help, you can feed her while I do dishes." Lanie was already reaching for the baby when she made a half-hearted protest. "You should feed her, and I'll do dishes. She's your child, after all." He didn't reply for the time it took her to get the baby settled in her arms and the bottle angled the way she'd seen him do. When she glanced up, he was rinsing the cutting board. "She is mine, right, Lanie?" he suddenly blurted, half-turning, so she could just see his jaw, clenched tight. "You're not here to take her away from me, right?" Dear God. Her eyes suddenly filled with tears, and she blinked rapidly, struck by the fear in his voice. "No," she managed in a hoarse whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "No, Blake. I'm sorry if I worried you. If it's easier, I don't have to visit." "No." He whirled around, still holding the wet cutting board. "I mean..." He shook his head, then plopped the board in the dish rack and dragged his wet hand through his dark hair. He looked absolutely scrumptious wearing those gray flannel pants, which hung low on his hips, and that red t-shirt, which clung to all the right places. And now, his hair was adorably rumpled. "I mean, we like you. A lot. I'm sorry I did whatever it was before to make you run off." He didn't say it, but he didn't have to. "The fact you work for the Department of Social Services just makes hanging out with you a little uncertain, I guess." It was weird to feel as if she were the one with all the power when it came to a charmer like Blake Littlelight. But she understood what he was saying. So she adjusted the baby in her arms and offered him a little grin. "Here's the deal, I can't promise I won't ever have to speak to you in my official capacity. I hope I don't, and no matter what I thought of you in the past, you can be certain I'll stand up in front of a judge and tell her or him that you're a good dad who wants to be a dad, and that'll count for a lot, I think." "But," she nodded. "If I have to speak to you in an official capacity, I promise to tell you that right up front, okay? I won't hide it." Slowly, he nodded, his gaze flicking between her face and Blossom's. Then he took a deep breath. "Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks." She grinned, and he mirrored it as he propped his hip against the counter. "So, what you thought of me in the past, huh?" "What was that?" "What was what?" She pretended not to know what he was talking about and lifted the bottle from the baby's mouth to check how much she'd drunk. "You said you had some thoughts about me in the past. Care to share?" "No, not really," she said breezily. He shrugged. "Okay, then tell me about your family." She blinked. "Why? You like boring topics?" Laughing, he shook his head, then crossed to pull Blossom out of her arms. When he leaned near, she got a whiff of his shampoo, and, whoops, there went her libido again. He placed the baby against his shoulder and patted her back until she belched loudly. Then, his eyes twinkling, he jerked his head toward the living room and ambled out. Lanie, of course, followed, holding the bottle. "Because, Dimples, I know your sisters are Artie, Aria, and Athena, right?" he asked, as he settled down on the couch and gestured for her to join him. Not sure how to deny the invite, or if she even wanted to, she sat down. Yeah. Athena's my twin." "Really? Do twins run in your family?" He placed Blossom back in her arms, and as Lanie arranged the bottle in the baby's mouth once more, he rested his arm across the back of the couch and watched her. "We have plenty of twins if that's what you're asking. My mom was a twin, and Dad's got some twins on his side. He's from Idaho, where his brother turned the ancestral ranch into a kind of touristy dude ranch, and there's twins all up and down that branch of the tree." He hummed. "Artie, Aria, Athena, and Lanie? How come your sisters all have A-names and you don't?" Rolling her eyes, she settled herself against the cushions, surprised to realize how relaxed she was. "We all have names that start with A, and there's more than just the four of us. Well, Athena was actually born Winifred, W names or something from my dad's side of the family, but she changed it to fit in." Ajax is the oldest, then Artemis and Apollo, then Ariadne, then me and Athena. But those names are a mouthful, so we go by nicknames. Jax, Artie, Pol, Aria. Gah, sometimes it's hard to keep track. Did I mention Dido and Dawn? Aphrodite and Adonis. She could tell he was trying not to laugh. That is a heck of a pedigree, Lanie. Not at all boring though. I can't imagine keeping you all straight. And that's still not all of us. Or maybe it is, I can never remember when I'm listing people off. Oh, Ares. Did I say him? Blake had given up on holding in his laughter. And why in the heck are you Lanie, instead of an A name? She had to smile. I'm Atlanta. His chuckles increased, dimples, as he shook his head. I can see why you go by Lanie. Hold on, I think I know this one. Atlanta. Wasn't she the racer? Yep, virgin huntress, sworn to Artemis. Artie thinks that's hilarious, by the way, and refused to marry. So a hero challenged her to a race, and when he enlisted the aid of Aphrodite, of course, Dido holds that over my head, the goddess gave him 3 golden apples. During the race, he tossed the apples in Atlanta's path, and she, apparently distracted by shiny things, kept stopping to pick them up. So he won, and she had to marry him. The baby had finished her bottle, so Lanie lifted her into a sitting position and patted her back. Blake was grinning at both of them. Maybe Atlanta secretly loved the hero, but had too much honor to lose the race. So she let herself be distracted by the golden apples in her path in order to have an excuse to marry him. Lanie felt herself blushing, and she focused on Blossom. Maybe, she whispered, unwilling to admit that had always been her suspicion too. Do you remember Blossom's first name? She glanced up at him. Apple? Grinning, he shifted closer. Apple. Maybe she's not golden, but... She's much better than gold, Lanie protested, her pats increasing in strength. Blossom let out a burp, then waved her arms happily. Dad? Ready for playtime? Blake asked, scooping her up under her arms and setting her upright on the floor. Gotta get you nice and tired so you sleep well. He grabbed a few pillows off the couch to pile around her, and when he returned to the couch, he managed to sit even closer to Lanie. And she didn't move away. What about your family? She blurted, a little too high-pitched. He managed to shrug languidly with his arm around the back of the couch. It was near enough to touch her if she just relaxed back against the cushions. She didn't, but it was torture. He's just trying to seduce you. Well, okay, let him seduce you. It might be fun. You don't have to be a virgin huntress. My dad and grandfather live up on the Crow Reservation. Grandpa joined the army during the Korean War as a medic and met my grandmother. She was a nurse, and her family didn't like the idea of her marrying a Native American when they returned home, but those two were really in love, and it eventually all worked out with her family. That's sweet. She didn't press back against him, but she did turn slightly, pulling one knee up on the couch so she could face him. They sound like they're full of interesting stories. Well, Grandpa is. Grandmother died a while ago, and he ended up raising Dad alone. They had money from her side of the family, and Grandpa pushed Dad to go to college like she'd always wanted. So Dad left the res, became an engineer and started his own company. Her eyes widened, and she realized she was leaning toward him. What kind of company? She asked in a low voice. His gaze dropped to her lips. It was, his tongue flicked over his lower lip, and he glanced away, at Blossom, who was waving her fists happily. He made barrel fittings. Met my mom, who liked the idea of marrying an engineer, but when the company went under, a newer method undercut them, more or less, and they had to move back to the res with Grandpa. She decided an engineer was fine, but not a poor half-native one. I'm sorry, she whispered. His shrug looked nonchalant, but those little lines at the corners of his eyes were back, telling her he wasn't totally at ease. It wasn't easy for Dad, that's for sure. When she filed for divorce, she said I'd be better off with my people, and the judge awarded Dad full rights. Lanie couldn't stop her gasp, and she dropped her hand to his forearm. I'm sorry, Blake, she repeated. That must have been really hard to come to grips with as a child. His mom hadn't wanted him. Just like Tolly Elliott didn't want little Apple Blossom. Lanie had a colleague looking for information on Blossom's mom, but if she truly didn't want to be a parent, then Blake was doing an amazing job stepping up in the role of the baby's parent. My, he's got nice forearms, doesn't he? This wasn't the right time to notice his forearms. Hi, ovaries again. As far as we're concerned, he's got nice everything, thank you very much. Oh good, at least the voices in her head were in agreement. He was looking down at her hand on his arm, and she still couldn't make herself move. Have they met Blossom? She blurted, not sure what else to say. Your father and grandfather, I mean? Not yet. His voice was low, and when he met her eyes, his gaze was intense. Want? I called of course, but I'm going to take her up there this weekend. Lanie, I think you ought to know that I really don't care to talk about my family right now. It was her turn to lick her suddenly dry lips. What do you want to talk about? She whispered. Kissing you. Oh. Lanie, is it okay if I kiss you? I've been trying not to make this weird, but I've wanted to kiss you for a... She shouldn't kiss him. She really shouldn't kiss him. Do it. Do it. She did. She surged forward, pressing her lips against his, and when he relaxed and wrapped his arms around her, she melted into his embrace. And for once, her inner monologue shut up. He was a good kisser. No. He was a brilliant kisser. Granted, he tasted like tuna fish, but so did she, so it was okay. No, it was better than okay. So much better. She whimpered, and he deepened the kiss, the baby cooing happily in the background. The kiss was slow and languid, just the two of them getting to know one another, but after, when he'd set her back upright, and she'd stared at him, flushed and panting and wide-eyed, he shook his head and smiled. Dimples. If you keep looking at me like that, Lanie, I'm going to kiss you again. Her gaze dropped to his lips. Okay, she whispered hungrily. This kiss was hot and desperate, and ended with her sprawled across his lap, his thigh wedged between her legs and a hardness pressed against her belly, as warmth pulsed between her legs. They might not have stopped. A big part of Lanie didn't want to stop. She wanted to keep going, to strip out of her sensible blouse and trousers, and let Blake Littlelight make love to her the way he'd loved Tolly Elliott, and 100 other women. But she didn't want to be just another one of his women. So she made herself push away and break the kiss. And thankfully, Blossom chose that moment to topple over on her side. She wasn't hurt, of course, but the yell of frustration she let out was a convenient excuse to jump off the couch, off Blake, and scoop the baby up. As Lanie cooed at Blossom, she tried not to watch Blake readjust himself. He scrubbed his hand across his face, and the frustration and need she saw there was almost enough to break her resolve. No. Be strong. Is she okay? The baby was fussing. Lanie took a deep breath. I think she's just ready for bed. I should be getting home. Nodding reluctantly, Blake stood, his arms out. As he took the baby, he caught and held Lanie's gaze. Lanie, I should apologize. Don't, she blurted. Then she forced a smile, knowing if he apologized for what had been the most amazing kiss she'd ever experienced, she'd be heartbroken. We don't have to mention it again. Hell yes, we're going to mention it again. He shifted awkwardly, then winced, and she did her best not to drop her eyes to the bulge in his pants. But maybe not tonight. Her lips tugged up ruefully. Deal. Thanks for dinner. Again. Thanks for, his breath burst out of him, with a laugh following close behind, everything, I guess. I really like hanging out with you, Lanie. Hanging out? Is that what the kids were calling it these days? But she smiled. I do too. Do you want to? He lifted the fussing baby to his shoulder and patted her bottom. We could do dinner again. I mean, we do dinner every night, but you're welcome to join us. Or you could just stop by when you need some cuddles. Baby cuddles, or whatever. Her smile grew as she slipped on the shoes she'd left at the door. I think stopping by might be on my agenda. I promise to text you prior to a minute before from now on. How about tomorrow? Or this weekend? His eagerness made a bubble start to fill inside her chest. It was completely unrelated to the desire she still felt pumping through her veins. It felt like happiness. You're going to visit your family this weekend, remember? Good luck. Next week? Next weekend? Both? Laughing, she crossed to him and leaned in, placing a kiss on the baby's head. I still have to return your shirt, so that's a possibility. And then, feeling powerful, because this charmer, this playboy, wanted her, she brushed a kiss across his lips. A strong possibility, she murmured. When his face lit up with hope, she doubted she was ever going to be able to say no. If Blake Littlelight wanted her as one of his conquests, she would be giving up on her personal convictions. But as aroused as he made her, it just might be worth it. Despite her best intentions, he'd be an easy man to love. Chapter 6. The water was the perfect temperature, and Blossom seemed to agree. Blake held her in the float he'd bought for her, his eyes level with hers, and smiled as she jerked her hands up and down, splashing in the water she could reach. Got it. Lanie yelled, waving a little sun hat, as she jogged down the rocky beach, toward them. I still can't believe you got all this stuff for her. Why not? He shrugged, not taking his eyes off the beautiful woman as she reached the edge of the water and stuck one sandaled foot in. She had to be kicked out to come play in my favorite swimming hole. Lanie splashed in up to her knees, then planted her hands on her hips and looked around. This place sure is pretty. Yeah, he drawled, though not looking at the scenery at all. He should have known his sensible Lanie wouldn't be all into bikinis and those skimpy bathing suits other women he'd taken swimming would be. She was wearing. Well, he wasn't sure what the style was called, but it almost looked like a short dress, with some blue frills around the bottom and the neckline. It was a pretty bathing suit, which wasn't something he would have thought before, and she looked dynamite in it, especially with her hair down. He smiled, realizing this was the first time since Seth's wedding he'd seen it like that. Her blonde hair was a little longer than her shoulders, but not by much. He wanted to touch it, but she was way over there on the shoreline, balancing in her water sandals on the rocky shore. So he called out, "Why don't you come in and admire the view?" She smirked as she picked her way out deeper. You're not talking about yourself, are you? Blake stood, water splashing off his shoulders, since he was only about waist deep, and made a big show of flexing his muscles. Blossom started laughing, and so did Lanie. When she joined them, she focused on strapping the sun hat to the baby, and Blake sank back down in the water. This place really is cool, Blake. Thanks for inviting me. Of course. I wanted you here for Blossom's first swim. Feeling relaxed, he tipped back to wet his hair. This bend in the river is one of my favorite places on the ranch, and at this time of year, the current isn't too strong. Are you sure about that? She called playfully, floating past. Chuckling, he picked his feet off the bottom, clamped onto Blossom's float with both hands, and let the current carry him as well. It's not as fast as earlier in the summer, at least. In a month or two, this river will be little more than a trickle as everything dries up. The deepest point was probably only 4 feet or so, but in the spring it was deeper and wilder. And colder. This is the perfect time to swim. Hey, wait up. Chuckling, she flipped over to her back. I can't help it if you're no good at floating. Want me to come back with a tube for you? Har har. He kicked to catch up with her. It's not my fault I sink. I'm made of muscle. Muscle sinks. Lanie put her feet down and stood, grinning mischievously. Oh? And since fat floats, I'm full of fat. To his surprise, she reached up and grabbed her own boobs, squeezing them together while she winked. His throat went dry. Ah. Laughing, she splashed upstream to catch him, then pressed a hard kiss to his mouth. Before he even had time to react, she was pulling away, still smiling, and took control of the baby's float from him. And Blake, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, watched her pull Blossom back upstream toward the little rocky beach. It took him a minute to recover. But after reaching under the water and adjusting his swimming trunks, he shook his head and splashed after them. They spent a half hour or so floating back and forth, splashing one another and the baby, and stealing kisses. Blake didn't think he'd ever forget the way she looked as she came up out of the water, her hair slicked back and droplets clinging to her lashes, grinning happily. She was gorgeous, yeah, but more than that, she was fun and funny and smart and made him happy. He ached to make her his. But she wasn't just one of the other women he dated. She was special, and he needed to tread carefully. Besides, there was Blossom to think of. Of course, he was thinking of Blossom. He was thinking about how she obviously liked Lanie as much as he did and how much fun it'd be to have Lanie in their lives full time. And how much easier it'd be to be a parent if he had a partner. Whoa there. Don't get ahead of yourself. There was an important reason why he couldn't just up and ask her to marry him. Although, if he were honest with himself, there'd been a few nights, since she'd started stopping by his house, when he had considered doing exactly that. But it was best just to enjoy their Saturday afternoon and not complicate it with anything serious. They'd had a picnic when they'd first arrived, and they had the whole river to themselves, which wasn't uncommon, since only Caudron Valley Ranch employees knew about it. Blake was simply looking forward to just relaxing for a few hours. After a while of playing, Blossom started to get fussy. Cooing softly to her, Lanie picked her up out of the float and fell backward, holding the baby out of the water. Blossom thought that was lots of fun, but after another few times, she got cranky again. So Lanie plopped her on her hip. They looked so natural together, it made his heart hurt, and gingerly picked her way out of the water. He grinned and reclined in the water, content to watch her. The way that swimsuit clung to all her curves had nothing to do with it. She sat Blossom down on the rocky shore, and the first thing the baby did was pick up a rock and try to put it in her mouth. Before Blake had a chance to do more than yell, "Whoa!" Lanie had grabbed the baby's hand and was gently tugging it away from her mouth. "Blossom, we don't eat rocks," she said firmly, as Blake began to splash out of the water. "They'll make your poops hard." Chuckling, he swiped water from his arms and chest, then tromped up the beach to where he'd left their bags. "I don't think hard poops would be the worst of our concerns if she ate a rock." Lanie had already picked up the baby and now hummed thoughtfully. "I guess it depends on how big the rock is." Blake spread out a fluffy red blanket on a small patch of grass in the shade of one of the trees growing near the beach, and Lanie laid Blossom down on her back. "I'm not sure any rocks are good to eat," Blake mused, sinking cross-legged beside his daughter. Grinning, Lanie scooped up a smooth oval one, about the size of her fist. "No, but they're fun to play with. Here you go, cupcake. No chewing, okay?" On her back, the baby reached for the rock, waved it with both hands, then dropped it on her belly. She let out a squawk of anger, and Lanie winced. "Sorry." "Okay, no rocks for baby." "Got it." Grinning, he picked up the rock and tossed it toward the water's edge. An important lesson in parenting. She snorted but threw a grin over her shoulder as she strolled back to the river. "Oh, so now you're an expert?" "No," he admitted quietly, "but every day, I'm learning." Parenting still terrified him, but after only a few weeks with Blossom, he couldn't imagine ever going back to the way things used to be. And the fact they might, the fact Lanie had the power to make that happen, if she ever found out the truth, well, that terrified him too. Blossom stuck her thumb in her mouth and did that thing where she reached for the hair behind her ear. She was getting sleepy, and he hesitated. He knew it was better for babies to nap in settings they were familiar with, but there wasn't any real harm in letting her nap here, at least for today. She was in the shade and had eaten and played. He hurried to pull off her sun hat and swim diaper, figuring he'd rather have to wash pee out of the blanket than have her nap in a wet bottom, and pulled a corner of the blanket over her. She kicked a little and murmured around her thumb, which made him smile. He loved she could self-soothe like that, as it showed she was smart and resilient. Satisfied she was ready for her nap, he leaned back on his hands and stretched his legs out in front of him. Lanie was stretched out in the shallows on her stomach, the sun already drying her hair, and was stacking the water-smoothed flat rocks into towers. He smiled as he watched her weigh the sizes of different rocks, deciding which one should go on the bottom, then finding the flattest side to stack. When she glanced up and caught him smiling at her, she didn't flush or look away, but smiled in return. Blake wanted to bottle up this feeling, this relaxation, and keep it forever. "Hey, how'd your visit up to the reservation go? I meant to ask you when I saw you earlier this week." He grinned. "Just like you meant to bring back my shirt?" This time, she did blush, but he wasn't sure why. "I told you I keep forgetting it. I'll get it back to you." He wasn't sure what she was doing with the t-shirt he'd loaned her, but he really liked the idea maybe she was wearing it and thinking of him. Just imagining his cotton shirt sliding over her naked skin aroused him. But he managed a quick, "No hurry," and she nodded. "So what did your family think of Blossom?" He forced himself to relax. "Grandpa was totally in love, which I could have told you he would be. I got some really great photos of him holding her and playing with her. The man's 85, I think he'd given up on living long enough to see any of his great-grandkids." She pushed herself up on her knees, then to her feet. "And your dad?" "Ah." His smile faded, and he shrugged. "Less enamored. I think he likes her well enough, but he made it clear he wasn't surprised one of my kids just popped up, and kept telling me he wasn't going to support her." Lanie planted her hands on her hips. "That sucks." "I'm sorry, Blake. What makes him think he'd have to support her? I've seen all the stuff you're buying for her." He glanced at Blossom, whose eyes were closed, as her lips moved around her thumb. "I think it's just him, thinking back on my own childhood and having to raise me alone. He lived with his father in order to make ends meet." Still frowning, she bent down to pick up some flat circular rocks. "I guess both your dad and your grandfather have experience being single parents, huh?" She turned to the river. "They both lost their wives early on. You don't even have a wife, so I can see how your father might be worried." One of his brows rose at her words, not having considered it that way. She twisted and flicked the rock out into the river, where it skipped once and sank. Her second try wasn't any better. Carefully, he pushed himself to his feet, not wanting to disturb the baby. But she was asleep now, and he only glanced over his shoulder once to check on her as he padded down to the river shore. "Here. Try it like this." He stepped up behind her, just as she straightened, holding another smooth skipping stone. When he put his left hand on her hip and took her right hand in his, she started, but almost immediately relaxed into his hold. "Try what?" she murmured. "Curl your forefinger around the outside edge of the stone, like this." He guided her finger into the correct position. "Now, when you let it go, give it an extra flick with that finger. It'll add an extra spin to the stone, which helps with the skips." She hummed, looking down at their hands. "Plus, it'll give it more force, like an otlotl does for a spear." He chuckled, constantly amazed by her brain. "Yeah, like that." Only his Lanie would make a connection between a Stone Age weapon and skipping stones. She twisted, and he twisted with her. When she threw the stone, it went farther than the last one, but only skipped twice. But she didn't immediately bend down to pick up another stone. No, she actually leaned back into his hold, and he dropped his right hand to her hip. Could she feel his hardness, pressing against her butt? Did she mind? Suddenly, she turned in his arms and twined her own arms around his neck. From the way she arched her back, pushing her pelvis against him, she not only definitely felt his arousal then, but apparently didn't mind. "Thanks, Blake," she murmured. "I always like learning new things." His brain went to mush. Partly because of the way she was looking at him, partly because of how damn sultry she sounded, but mainly because of how good she felt pressed against him. Lord help him, but the feel of her in that frilly swimsuit, with all her curves hugging his. He swallowed. "Happy to help," he managed to choke out. Then she chuckled and dropped one hand from his neck to run over his bare chest. He sucked in a breath when her fingers reached his stomach, and he felt his muscles tighten under her touch. "Do you know how good you look without a shirt, Blake?" She grinned wryly and rolled her eyes. Don't answer that. Of course you do. That's your thing, isn't it? Well, it's working, mister. She met his eyes, and he saw hers were clouded with desire. It's working, she repeated in a whisper, just before she pushed herself up on her tiptoes, her lips reaching for his. This kiss. This kiss. It was the best Blake could ever remember. The best, if he were honest with himself, he could imagine. Not because she was a beautiful woman on a lazy summer day, and they were half naked and beyond aroused. But because it was Lanie. And he wasn't sure how much more of this sweet torture he could take. He was the one to break the kiss, pressing his forehead against hers, as he tried to gain control of his breathing. Her fingers were still skimming over his chest, and as much as he knew he was close to bursting, he couldn't deny how perfect it felt. He had to be brutally honest with her. Licking his lips, he tried again, I really want you, Lanie. Good. She hummed. Because I want you too, Blake. I know I shouldn't, but I do. Why shouldn't you? We love each other. His lips clamped down on the words, in a desperate sort of self-preservation, and his eyes widened. Love each other? That would mean he loved her, and he'd just met her, hadn't he? Of course, they'd hung out a lot this week, and last week, and there had been more than a few kisses, and they'd also been texting quite frequently, so he felt as if he really knew her, which doesn't mean she has feelings for you, idiot. It was only then he realized she hadn't responded to his aborted objection. Instead, she'd pressed her cheek against his shoulder and had wrapped her arms around his middle. He swallowed again, nervous to know what she was thinking. Lanie? Her hold tightened. I understand that my brain doesn't have to be engaged to be as attracted to you as I am. You are? He blurted. You're attracted to me? She huffed a little laugh. If it's not obvious yet, I am definitely attracted to you. And very aroused, thank you very much. Well, that helped boost his ego a little. But remember last week, when you asked me about my thoughts about you? He dropped his chin to the top of her head and hummed slightly. Does this have to do with you calling me a philanderer when you came to my house the first time? When she nodded, she knocked against his chin, but he didn't move his head away. Holding her this way felt too good. I could tell from the way you acted at Aria's wedding, and the stories I'd heard about you, that you're a philanderer? I can hear you smiling, she mumbled. Don't make fun. It's better than calling you a slut. He snorted and squeezed her once. True. Thank you for that. Is that really what you think of me? She paused, then exhaled. Am I wrong? He pulled back, but only just far enough so he could see her face. Smiling, he brushed a tendril of hair blowing across her cheek and tucked it behind her ear, though he loved seeing her hair free and blowing in the soft wind. Staring up at him, Lanie seemed to be waiting for him to find the words to explain, and he wasn't going to disappoint her. It's true I like to take different women out on dates, he finally admitted. But that's all it is, fun. I like hanging out with different women, learning about them, making them laugh. The way she snorted slightly and looked away from him, told Blake what she was thinking more than any words could. In his arms, she'd tensed up and was holding her breath. She'd assumed, when he'd said, learning about them, he'd meant learning about their bodies. She'd assumed he'd been taking them back to his house or to a hotel and making love to them. He glanced over at Blossom, sleeping in the shade. The baby was content and safe with him, and in a few short weeks she'd become one of the foci of his world. Telling Lanie the truth about himself might endanger that. She worked for DSS, and if she knew his secret, he couldn't risk it. So he contented himself with just whispering, Lanie, you're special. When she let out a little disappointed sound with her breath, he felt as if he'd failed a test. Her smile appeared brittle when she turned her face back to his once more. Good. I want to be special. I don't want to be a one-night stand. Impossible. I already have 2 nightstands. She narrowed her eyes. Was that a pun? It sounded like a pun. Sorry, dad joke. It comes with the territory. Look, Blake, I don't want to be just another one of your women. You're not, he hurried to assure her. You are special. But from the look in her eyes, she didn't believe him. I'll bet you say that to every woman. Well, every woman is special, in their own ways, but only you, Lanie, are special to me. Maybe it was the right thing to say, because her glare faded, and she seemed to really consider his words. So you're telling me you like me for who I am? His answer was immediate. Absolutely. Blake more than liked her, but he couldn't tell her that now. It wasn't the right time, not when she was still doubting him. Well then, when was the last time you took out a woman? He blinked. What? Lanie pushed away from him, still touching, but not pressed close against him as she had been. Have you taken out a woman since that first time you invited me to stay for dinner? An image of Janet Richards, sitting across the table from him at that lobster place, her foot on his leg, flashed across Blake's mind. And maybe, somehow, Lanie saw the thought in his expression, because she offered him a sad smile. That's what I thought. And that's why, as much as I really want to be with you, Blake, and when I say be with you I mean sex, giving myself to you, allowing you to make love to me until I scream your name, I can't. He felt as if he'd been sucker punched as he listened to her list off the definitions of what being with him meant to her. He couldn't get his throat to work, and his lungs couldn't seem to suck in any air. All he could do was focus on the vision of Lanie, naked and glistening on his bed, crying out his name, as he brought her pleasure again and again. He swallowed and said, but Lanie. That same, sad smile still in place, she shook her head and patted his chest as she stepped away. It's harder on me than it is you, Blake, believe me. The desire straining against the inside of his swim trunks begged to differ, but as she turned away and bent over, scooping up more skipping stones, he realized he couldn't say anything further. There was nothing he could say, which wouldn't make him sound more like a philanderer. So he sighed and picked up some stones of his own to throw, and tried to forget their last conversation ever happened. It was a relaxing and fun afternoon on the river, and he'd gotten to spend it with his two favorite females. It should be easy to forget about her looking up at him, with those blue eyes, as she explained exactly what she meant by be with you. Chuckling at himself, Blake shook his head and stepped up beside Lanie, determined to forget. Easier said than done. Chapter 7. I can't believe you just got chocolate. All those fantastic flavors, and you ordered a normal chocolate ice cream? Blake just grinned at her teasing, then waggled his cone in her direction as they strolled on. Whoever heard of strawberry rhubarb being good? Lanie gaped. What do you mean? This is like the best flavor ever. I've loved it since Athena introduced me to it, although I would never admit it to her. It's my duty to irritate my twin, after all. She grows interesting plants in her greenhouses. She offered him the cone. Want a lick? His eyes had twinkled throughout her lecture, but instead of taking the offered lick, he released the stroller handlebars, toed the lock, then pulled Lanie toward him with his free hand. Before she could do anything more than squeal in surprise, he licked her lips. She was laughing when she wrapped her arm around him, stretched up on her toes, and kissed him right back. He hummed, as they pulled apart, smiling. You're right. That isn't terrible. She snorted and nudged his shoulder, feeling at ease and happy in a way she hadn't ever felt before. Maybe it was the ice cream, it really was her favorite flavor, or maybe it was the lovely sunny day. Maybe it was how adorably friendly the town of Caudron Valley was, and how everyone smiled and waved as they passed, or cooed at sweet little Blossom. Or maybe it was because of the man walking beside her. In the days since their river outing, not much had changed. She still stopped by after work most days, and he still cooked her dinner. They'd kissed, sure, and maybe that had led to some touching, but it hadn't gone any further than that. And he hadn't pushed her to go any further, and while a part of her was a little miffed at that, her libido, in particular, the rest of her was grateful he'd listened to what she'd said. But if he had listened, how come he hadn't pushed her aside and moved on? He was a man who clearly enjoyed women's company, and by company of course she meant sex, as evidenced by the baby who was, at this moment, reaching up from her stroller, looking frustrated. Everyone else was enjoying ice cream but her. "Are you sure we can't give her just a little taste?" Lanie asked, her eyes pleading for him to say yes. She looked so desperate. Chuckling, Blake shook his head. "No sweets until her first birthday." He smiled at his daughter. "That way you're going to really enjoy your cupcake, and I don't have to worry about tooth rot." "Have you already come up with a theme?" When he lifted a brow in question, Lanie hurried to explain, "For her first birthday party, I mean. A cupcake theme might be fun, all pinks and purples, and I'm sure Griselda would make plenty of her famous cupcakes if we asked." Instead of responding, Blake turned his face away, staring not at Lanie or the baby, but at the road ahead. Now that she thought of it, he always did that when she talked about the future with Blossom. Why? It was clear he loved the baby and obviously planned to keep her forever. "Maybe," was all he said, before nodding politely to an older couple who passed by them. Lanie watched him closely and saw the moment he dragged his thoughts back to his daughter when the baby made a lunge for the last of his ice cream. He shook his head, popped the cone in his mouth, and handed Blossom one of the strange little ice cream toppers they'd gotten. It looked for all the world like one of the little cocktail umbrellas, the paper kind which could open and close, but this one was made of plastic and too large for a baby to swallow. "That's not too sharp for her, is it?" Blake shook his head. "Nah, they're made for kids." He handed Lanie the other one once she finished her cone. "See? Rainy Dave's always includes them with every ice cream. That way, the kids can take them home and open them in their rooms for good luck and not wreck their parents' real umbrellas." She squinted down at the toy in her hand, then up at Blake as they walked. "Wait, what? Umbrellas in their rooms bring good luck?" He shrugged, navigating around a pothole in the sidewalk and going out of his way to stomp on a few of the cracks. "Well, opening the umbrella inside is still good luck, but if you do it in your room specifically, it's good luck just for you." No. Opening umbrellas indoors is bad luck, no matter where it's done." Blake chuckled as if he were teasing her. Lanie was flabbergasted. "You really believe that it's good luck? Why not give her something else to play with?" "Sure, it's the best kind of luck." He shrugged. "What else should I give her? Stickers?" Lanie hit her shudder. Truthfully, she'd always hated stickers. They were just so icky. Stickers sticking to paper was okay, she supposed, but when kids stuck them to their clothes or their shirts. Ew. Still, it was probably safer than an umbrella. "I guess so." To her surprise, he laughed. "Everyone knows stickers are really bad luck." "I thought you grew up around here." "I did. I think maybe Caudron Valley has its own brand of good and bad luck," she mused, as Blake emphatically stomped on another crack in the sidewalk, "but if it involves avoiding stickers, I'm okay with it." "Good." He shot her a grin, then reached out and took her hand, his other hand wrapped around the stroller handle. "Come on." At the stoplight, he tugged her across the street to a sweet little park. There were a few people there walking dogs, and a game of frisbee was being played by a small group of teenagers. Blake stopped under a big oak tree next to a park bench. As he reached into the stroller to unsnap Blossom's restraints, he said, "I have a favor to ask. I need someone to babysit Blossom tomorrow night." When he straightened the baby against his shoulder, he looked a little awkward. "I know I could ask any of the ladies around the ranch. Truthfully, little CJ Caudron is half in love with her already, and I know Seth and Arya would do it in a heartbeat." Lanie stood frozen, speechless. He was asking her to care for his precious baby, yet also feeling honored, because he obviously trusted her enough to do so. He took a breath and plopped down on the bench. "But Blossom is most comfortable with you. She loves you." As he said the words, he turned the baby so she was sitting in his lap, then pointed to one of the dog walkers. "See the puppy, Blossom?" "Nice puppy," he murmured, patting his thigh in a sign Lanie recognized as the baby sign language for dog. "I love her," she whispered, watching the two of them. It was clear this man adored his daughter, even though he'd only known her a short time. He'd done so much research and had thrown himself wholeheartedly into parenting. "I love her." Lanie could admit that to herself, but why did the thought of loving him make her want to cry? Was it because she was afraid he didn't see her as anything more than one of his other women, despite his claims? Blake glanced at her, still pointing to the dogs. Would you mind coming to the house tomorrow after work? It'll be for quite a while, so you'll probably have to put her down for the night and everything. Why did he seem so nervous? I'd be happy to, Lanie said carefully as she sat beside them, still watching the father and daughter and wondering what she was missing. It's flattering to know you trust me with her. I do. His declaration was immediate. And when the baby leaned forward, holding her arms to Lanie, his lips twisted in a little grin. And she does too, which is even more important. When he lifted Blossom, Lanie was happy to take the baby from him, standing Blossom's chubby feet on her thighs and bouncing her under the arms. Blake cleared his throat. Routine is important, and you're very much a large part of her life and our routine. In fact, I feel weird even calling this babysitting, because you're basically one of her caregivers. Lanie knew what he'd been about to say, and the thought made her all warm and squishy inside. Parent. She snuggled her nose against the baby's sweet-smelling neck and blew a raspberry, causing Blossom to laugh. Yes, Lanie loved this baby in a way she hadn't expected to, and she loved Blossom's father too. Which was problematic. More to distract herself than anything else, Lanie cleared her throat. I'd love to watch her tomorrow night. We can have a girls' night. I'll paint my toes, and she can rub oatmeal in her hair, then we'll call it a day. Where are you going anyhow? The question was an afterthought, but his reaction was decidedly strange. Lifting one hand to rub the back of his neck, Blake looked away. I have a dinner I have to go to. A business dinner. She lifted a brow. A business dinner shouldn't solicit this level of awkwardness. With Wyatt, she pushed, turning Blossom around, so the baby sat on her lap. Blowing out a breath, Blake leaned forward and planted his elbows on his knees. She saw him wince. With a client, she wanted to do dinner this time. Lanie turned her stare forward. I see. No, he blew out a breath, then suddenly stood. Running his hand through his hair, Blake began to pace along the sidewalk in front of her. She tried not to follow his movements, but it was impossible. It's not what you think, he finally burst out, whirling to pin her with a stare. He wants you to babysit his kid while he goes out on a date. Ouch. You're taking a woman out to dinner, Blake. I know your reputation, and I know your past. For emphasis, she bounced little Blossom on her knee. What am I supposed to think? For some reason, when she pointed out the baby as evidence of his past indiscretions, he winced again and looked away. Well, what did he expect? He'd fathered a child with some fling. Janet Richards isn't a woman I'm interested in dating. It really is just a business dinner. I need her to sign a contract with the rodeo, and she insisted on discussing it over dinner. Lanie stood up. Does she know that? He glanced at her in confusion. Sure. It was her idea. No, I mean, does she know it's only a business dinner? Or does she know your reputation and expects it to be something else? Something flickered in his lovely aqua eyes, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook. Blake, she asked quietly, bouncing the baby on her hip. Does this Janet woman expect more than business? His voice was hoarse when he bit out, I'm not a whore. Does she know that? Damn it, Lanie. The words burst out of him, and he whirled around, raking his hand through his hair in exasperation. What do you expect from me? Yes. Yes, she thinks this is more than business. I let her think that because I need this contract to go through. The rodeo needs this contract to go through. Lanie pressed her lips together, to keep from commenting. Blake cocked his head just enough she could see his jaw, when he said, I'm not planning on doing anything more than whining and dining her, and trying to talk her into signing. But the point is, Blake, you have a date tomorrow. A business date, sure, but a date. Last weekend, by the river, when I asked you if you'd seen any other woman since deciding I was special. You are special, he exploded, turning to face her once more. I haven't dated anyone since Blossom became mine. Just you. Are we really dating though? No. No, because if they were dating, Blake wouldn't have been seeing someone else, business or not. Let me ask you something, Blake. If you and I were dating, really dating, if we were a couple I mean, would this Janet have pushed you for this business dinner? He frowned. No. When I asked her to lunch originally, she was really clear she would only accept if I was single. She asked that a few times, and told me I couldn't fool with her on that. Did he still not understand? And since then, have you told her that you've met someone special? His wince was the only answer she needed. When he looked away again, Lanie pressed her lips together to keep them from quivering. If Blake didn't understand what she was trying to explain, then he didn't deserve to have her, special or not, in his life. She pulled Blossom up to her chest and burrowed her nose in the baby's sweet-smelling hair. I love you, little one, she breathed, as one fat tear leaked from the corner of her eye to plop on the baby's head. When Blossom began to squirm, she raised the baby higher and placed a few last kisses on her plump cheeks, blinking rapidly to keep more of the tears at bay. Then she straightened, and taking a deep breath, placed the baby in the stroller. Blossom wasn't happy about it, but Lanie couldn't stay any longer. With as much dignity as she could muster, she gathered her purse, then turned to find Blake watching her, his hands curled into fists, and pain in his eyes. Goodbye, Blake. Good luck finding a babysitter tomorrow. Lanie. His voice cracked. Don't. If you have any respect for this Janet, you'll tell her the truth about yourself. Not that he'd found someone special, because after today, Lanie wasn't going to be a part of his life, in any way. Tell her you're a serial dater, who isn't after anyone special, but you have a daughter. For Blossom's sake, you need to start being more discerning. Her voice cracked on that last line, and she found herself backing away from both of them. Lanie, he took a step toward her, but she shook her head and turned away. Goodbye, she whispered, as she began to walk, then jog, away from them both. And when the tears began to fall, she didn't even notice. Chapter 8. She was right. He should have told Janet about Lanie, about Blossom. If he had, she wouldn't have pushed him for a dinner date. Of course, she wouldn't be signing the contract either. Would she? Maybe he wasn't being fair to Janet. He knew he hadn't been fair to Lanie. Blossom was the only female in his life right now, he was absolutely certain he wasn't hurting. But that might change once Lanie knew the truth. But Blake had realized something important. He couldn't hope to have a relationship with Lanie if he didn't tell her the truth. He might lose Blossom, which would hurt more than anything else he could imagine, but at least he'd be certain he was doing the right thing. Maybe for everyone. His thoughts had constantly wandered away from his work and onto his personal life most of the morning. When Wyatt commented on his distraction, for the second time, Blake felt as though he had no choice but to tell his boss he needed to leave work early, although he assured him he'd do his best to get the contract signed at dinner that evening. Wyatt frowned at him, his eyes searching Blake's face for a hint at why he was in such bad shape. Finally, he shook his head. Man, I dunno what's going on with you, but you gotta do what's best for you and that kid of yours. We need this contract. Yeah, I know, Blake interrupted. But Wyatt just shook his head again. But I don't want you to do anything you're not okay with. Make whatever decision is right for you, and I'll support you. Blake hesitated, already halfway out the door, before turning and facing his boss. A month ago, when you told me about Janet Richards, it was my idea to charm her into signing the contract. I liked the idea of meeting someone new, having a good dinner with her, enjoying her company. But, things have changed. I've changed. I met someone I really like, and the idea of charming Janet into signing that contract just isn't appealing to me anymore. Slowly, Wyatt nodded. Okay. I get that. Thanks for telling me. With a sigh, he ran his hand through his hair. Well, look, she's probably expecting something pretty clear from you tonight, yeah? And if you show up there and tell her she's not going to get it, then that will be a pretty big hiccup in the plan. Blake snorted at the understatement. His boss shrugged. So we'll figure out something else. If she's mad enough not to sign, we'll just change the plan. We're not going to find a new company to sign a concessions contract with this late in the game. Maybe not, Wyatt said, but it wouldn't be the end of the world if we have terrible concessions for a third year, I guess. But then, we'd have a full year to find a new contract. Yeah, Big Dick's pocket sausages would make us the most money, and hell, anything is better than what we're making now, but there are other distributors out there. It was strangely freeing to hear Wyatt say that, and Blake exhaled. But those pocket sausages would bring in a lot. It's not worth it, Blake. Wyatt offered a wry grin. You're more important than a sausage contract. Blake snorted again, but grinned in return. Thanks, boss man. Yeah. Just get out of here and figure out how you're going to tell Janet the truth. You owe it to her. And, I figure, to yourself. Blake was happy to take his boss's suggestion. He didn't head into town to pick up Blossom as soon as he left work, but instead, he took the extra few hours she was in daycare to drive down to the river and practice skipping stones while he thought about what Lanie had said yesterday, and what Wyatt had said today. He knew he owed Janet the truth about his feelings for Lanie and the addition of Blossom to his life. But he also decided he owed Lanie the truth too. The whole truth. Back home, Blake took his time getting ready, knowing Janet would expect it, then picked out a cute little dress he'd purchased for Blossom. He drove into town to pick her up from the daycare and solicited her teacher's help in getting his daughter all dressed up. They cooed over the sparkly headband with the pink flower. Blossom's blonde hair wasn't long enough to put bows in yet, and he hoped to God she'd still be a part of his life when it was, and they also helped him buckle on the tiny patent leather shoes. Do you two have a date tonight? One of them had asked flirtatiously, and he'd smiled. A very important one. He hoped. In the car, he pulled out his phone and tried calling Lanie. She didn't pick up, so he left a message. Hey, Lanie, it's me. I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday, and you're right. I'm going to try to set things right tonight, and I'd like to talk to you after, if that's okay? I have some things I need to tell you, important things, so I'd rather tell you face to face. If that's possible. I know you're pretty mad at me, and I get that, but, let me know if you're willing to, I dunno. Can I make you dinner? He sighed, not sure if he was making things even worse. From behind him in her car seat, Blossom began babbling and the sound made him smile. So he finished the message with, Blossom misses you too. Please let me know. Bye. And then, just to be certain she got the message, he texted her, I'm sorry. We need to talk. Please. I have something important to tell you. And then, taking a deep breath, he climbed out of the car, unstrapped Blossom, and headed into the fancy restaurant where he knew Janet would be waiting. It was dinner time, but the place had a private feel to it, which is why she'd chosen it, he knew. The maitre d' curled his lip when he saw Blossom against Blake's shoulder, and the diaper bag felt out of place. But Blake forced a smile. I'm sure we won't be staying too long. I'm meeting Janet Richards. Could you have a high chair brought to our table, please? The man sniffed haughtily, then swept a little bow. I believe we have a high chair in the storage room somewhere. The lady is waiting for you already. This way, monsieur. The man faded away quietly after leading Blake to the table, so he missed the way Janet's eyes lit up. Darling. But then her gaze dropped to the baby in his arms, and a look of confusion crossed her face. Her tone was still falsely cheerful, though clearly also confused, when she asked, and who is this? The moment of truth. Blake took a deep breath and held it for a few seconds, before exhaling and preparing himself for the worst. Janet, this is my daughter, Blossom. Right on cue, the baby batted at his shoulder with her fists. Dad. He didn't acknowledge her, but kept his eyes on Janet, so he saw the moment her confusion turned to anger. She'd obviously already made herself comfortable, judging from the plate of oysters and the wineglass in her hand. Though now, her fingers tightened around the fragile stem. You told me you were single, Blake, she hissed. I was. He scrubbed a hand over his face. Look, can I sit, Anne? At that moment, the maitre d' returned with a high chair and began setting it up at the side of the table between the two adults. Nodding gratefully, Blake accepted the distraction of getting Blossom seated, then poured out some Cheerios on the white linen tablecloth, all while the maitre d' sniffed disapprovingly. Then, with a rueful smile, Blake sank into his own chair. Janet had been eyeing his daughter, but now she raised her brow to him in question. "Janet, when I asked you to lunch, it was to discuss the contract." "Yes, darling. I've had the time to look over it, and it seems in order." He decided it was probably best just to get it said. "I'm the kind of man who enjoys a woman's company, and I know you're the kind of woman who enjoys a man like me. I was counting on our mutual enjoyment to smooth the process along." She studied him for a moment, then took a sip of her wine. After, she nodded thoughtfully. "Of course, you're not the first to make such assumptions. And I had assumed we'd both get what we wanted." But, her eyes flicked to the baby, and for the first time, he saw hurt in the older woman's face. "You lied to me." "I didn't." Another deep breath. "This is Blossom. When I met you, I didn't know I even had a daughter." The waiter had poured Blake some of the wine before he'd left them, and he sipped at it while telling Janet about the game night party which had completely changed his life. She listened intently, occasionally chuckling and making her own comments, and he was able to relax. "Darling," she drawled, nibbling at one of the artesian rolls, "that is a story straight out of a soap opera. Or maybe one of those romance novels I would never admit to reading." Blossom kicked happily, burbling as she reached for one of the rolls. Blake moved the basket to the other side of the half-empty oyster plate, "They really were good," and nudged a few more Cheerios in her direction. This was going better than he'd expected. Janet had obviously enjoyed the story, and he was feeling much more relaxed. But now for the important part. He took another deep breath, then told her the rest. "But here's the deal, Janet. There's this woman, a social worker, who has been coming to check on the two of us. Since then, she and I have been seeing a lot of each other." "In a professional setting?" There was still a smidge of hope in the older woman's gaze, so Blake held it and told her the truth. "No." She hummed and sipped from her wine. Finally, she asked, "Do you like her?" "Yes. A lot." Her eyes narrowed, and her chin dropped. "Do you love her?" His answer was immediate. "I do. I really do." "That's impressive, coming from a man like you." He grinned. "Maybe. But I consider myself lucky to have her and Blossom in my life. I met you before I met her, and I knew I needed that contract signed, so I kept my mouth shut about Lanie, but recently, I realized it wasn't fair to you or her. Or me either." So, he lifted his wineglass with a little shrug. Janet's gaze drifted to Blossom. "She really is a beautiful little girl, isn't she?" Blake had nothing to do with that, but he knew what he was expected to say in response. "Thanks. I'm amazed how thoroughly she's become my whole world, in such a short amount of time." Janet's smile was a little wistful when she nodded. "You are lucky, Blake. And you've impressed me, not just by how devoted you've obviously become to your daughter, but that you came here today to tell me the truth. It would have been easy to continue to lie to all of us in order to get what you wanted." Blake shook his head, his lips tugging upward ruefully. "No, Janet, it wouldn't have been easy. Not to me at least. Not now. And that's why you've impressed me." Suddenly, Janet plopped her glass down and reached for the briefcase he hadn't noticed sitting on the floor beside her chair. She snapped it open, then pulled out a portfolio and handed it across the table. Blake hesitated, then reached out to take the folder from her. When he opened it, he immediately saw the exclusivity contract with Big Dick's Pocket Sausage Company. And it was signed. He glanced up to find his company's new vendor still smiling, though now her smile seemed a bit wistful. "You're a good man, Blake. I very much would have liked to have gotten to know you better, and I won't lie and tell you I wasn't looking forward to tonight." Blake was still floored by her gesture, and the trust she'd shown him. "Janet, he shook his head, trying to clear it. "If I hadn't met Lanie, I want you to know I would have really been looking forward to tonight as well." But as it is, he glanced at Blossom, who was beginning to lose interest and arch backward in her chair. I have a date with another young lady, and a bathtub shaped like a rubber ducky, and some Dr. Seuss books. When she laughed, Janet looked younger than him, and he found himself smiling in return. Darling, as cute as she is, I have no interest in either of those latter two things, nor the myriad of new baby-related items I'm sure you're discovering daily. Even so, I appreciate your honesty and hope that contract proves it. She nodded to the portfolio he still held. Big Dick's Pocket Sausages, we're considering rebranding as just Pocket Sausages, now that my father's gone. Did I mention that? Would be pleased to partner with the rodeo, and you tell your boss that you were the one to convince me. Blake grinned and reached across the table to take her hand. He stood and leaned forward, giving her delicate fingers a soft kiss. He grinned at her when she giggled and a blush turned her cheeks a soft pink. Oh, go on, darling, and take your little princess home. She waved her hand in dismissal. I think I'll be leaving myself. Are you certain? Blake was already reaching for his daughter. I promised you dinner, and I don't mind. Really? And he wouldn't mind racking up a bigger bill for Wyatt either. You did, but the wine and appetizers and that delightful story was more than enough. I look forward to telling all my friends about your exploits. She winked, and Blake grinned, knowing his reputation would soon be officially ruined. He'll soon go from being a ladies' man to being a father, and he couldn't be happier. Well, actually, he could, but it required Lanie in order for that to happen. By the time he'd reached home and fed Blossom her bottle, it was obvious Lanie wasn't going to call him back or return his text message. So, sighing, he bathed his daughter and debated calling her again. He ate some leftovers while Blossom played, then read her some of their favorites books. Throughout Hop on Pop, Blossom liked to clap at the rhymes. Blake had trouble concentrating. He'd been so certain he was on the right path. Today had seemed like the day for confessions. Speaking with Janet had gone better than he could have imagined, but Lanie. Sighing, he acknowledged he couldn't do anything further. He loved her and wasn't going to let her go easily, but for now, he had to wait for her to be ready and willing to listen to him. She had to be ready to hear the truth, and he had to be ready to accept the consequences. She didn't say anything in response, but pressed her cheek against his shoulder again. Blake wanted to know what she was thinking, but he also didn't want to push her. So he tightened his hold on her and tried to refrain from kissing her. After a long moment, she hummed thoughtfully against his chest. You and I are the only ones who know the truth about Tolly Elliott, right? He grunted an affirmative. And your name is listed on the birth certificate. It is. I've had my lawyer working on becoming her legal guardian or whatever. I don't mind if everyone else thinks I knocked Tolly up and left her alone, but you. He gave in to temptation and brushed a kiss across her temple. I couldn't let you think that. In my job, I see plenty of families who aren't related by blood, she said carefully, as if working through the problem out loud. Even if your name wasn't on the birth certificate, I would stand in front of a judge and agree that you are the best father to Blossom, and she's lucky to have you. Elation coursed through him, and this time, his lips lingered against her skin. Are you sure, Lanie? He murmured, holding his breath. I don't want you to do anything you're uncomfortable with. Nodding, she pulled away enough to meet his eyes. I appreciate you telling me. But I think it's best if we just keep this secret between ourselves. Understanding came so swiftly, and so strongly, his eyes filled with tears. She saw it and smiled. You are Blossom's father, in every way that matters, Blake. I love you, Lanie Weston. Her smile grew. I love you too. I have for a long time, even though I didn't want to. I didn't want to be just another one of your conquests. She loved him. And now that you know you're not, he whispered, not caring when a tear fell from the corner of his eye. Now that I know the truth, I suppose there's really only one thing left to do, she said with a dramatic sigh. His gaze fell to her lips, and he knew what he wanted to do. And what's that? I'm going to marry you, Blake Littlelight. His surprised gaze flew back up to hers in a hurry. Are you proposing to me? She grinned. Did it work? You really want to spend the rest of your life with me, Lanie? Forever? Is that what you want? You mentioned a future. Unable to contain himself, he claimed her lips with his own. She whimpered against his mouth, and he deepened the kiss. Then, right when he knew he either had to back off or explode, he picked her up and spun her around, right there in the middle of his living room. Her foot knocked against the table, but their ice cream survived the jolt, and they were both laughing when he set her back down again. Lanie, will you marry me? Oh no, Buster. I asked you. Fine then. He grinned. Lanie Weston, I'd be honored to be your husband. Good. Her smile turned downright wicked as she reached for his collar to drag his lips down to hers. Because I have all sorts of ideas for how we can spend that future together. Chapter 10. They didn't get married right away, but that was okay. To Lanie, it was proof of the truth Blake had told her. It was obvious he wanted her as much as she wanted him, and the kind of man she'd always assumed he was wouldn't have waited for that sort of thing. In fact, that particular knowledge had been what had confused her for so long. Why hadn't a playboy like Blake been jumping at the opportunity to sleep with her? Well, because he wasn't that kind of man, and now she knew the truth. So yes, the wait was hard on both of them, but oh so worth it. When the pastor announced, "You may kiss the bride," Lanie had forgotten where they were. Blake's kiss was just that good, and they only broke apart when the laughter and cheers from their family and friends finally filtered through. Well, that, and the pastor's exasperated and repeated, ahem, before finally nudging them. Laughing, Blake reached around her and scooped little Blossom out of Athena's arms and tossed her into the air. The little girl squealed with delight in her lovely white dress, then threw her hands out to Lanie, and shouted, "Mama mama dada." And Lanie's heart grew even bigger. At the reception, she nearly wore her feet out dancing with her husband. She couldn't help recalling Aria's wedding, where she'd done her best to avoid Blake, who had danced with every woman there, but now she knew the truth about him, her husband, and knew he only had eyes for her now. "Are you sure you don't want me and Seth to take care of this little sweetie?" Aria asked, cuddling Blossom against her shoulder. "Nope," Lanie answered with an exhausted smile as she reached for the baby. "You'll have to get your own." "Believe me," her sister said with a roll of her eyes, "we're working on it." Instead of a wedding cake, Blake had arranged for some of Griselda's cupcakes. He'd apparently wanted cupcakes with red icing, though Lanie didn't understand why. The Cauldron's housekeeper had shaken her finger at him and grinned. "Oh, no, mister. That cupcake isn't for you this time. I'll frost them in white, since it's a wedding. But I promise to make a bunch of pink frosted cupcakes for your little cupcake's birthday when the time comes, deal?" Lanie didn't understand why Blake had been so amused by that, and also when one of his friends, a rancher from a nearby ranch named Cody Langley, was presented the coveted red cupcake. Blake had laughed, then proceeded to drag Lanie around to introduce her to all of his friends. She knew some of them of course, such as Seth and Aaron and Blake Wyatt, all of whom were married to her sisters. His friend, Rhodey, was a handsome man with an easygoing smile, who nodded politely and called her Mrs. Littlelight, while tickling Blossom's chin. Another friend, Joe, worked in the stables with Seth and Aaron, and seemed very nice, as did the short, pretty woman he introduced as Alcatraz. There was another cowgirl there, Rusty, who didn't seem particularly thrilled. In fact, she looked almost sullen, and a little pale. Lanie noticed she was spending a lot of time studying Blossom. When Blake offered to let her hold the baby, Rusty turned even paler, shook her head violently, and escaped toward the ladies' room. Neither Lanie nor Blake knew what to make of that, but they were soon distracted by Janet Richards next. They'd both agreed she needed to be invited to the wedding, and the woman seemed delighted to be included. She even patted little Blossom on the head, although she made no move to hold the baby. "Blake, darling, who is that handsome man scowling over in the corner?" Surprised, both Blake and Lanie turned to see who she was referring to. "That's my father," Blake blurted, amusement lifting one corner of his lips. "Would you like an introduction?" The woman hummed thoughtfully, tapping her finger against her lips. "I think I can manage on my own, darling, but thank you. Go. Enjoy your party, you two." She sauntered off in the direction of Blake's father, and the newlyweds exchanged an incredulous look. "Do you really think?" Lanie began. But Blake just shook his head. "I don't know. Meeting her might put a smile back on Dad's face though." Lanie had to chuckle. She'd gone with Blake to meet his family soon after he'd accepted her marriage proposal, and when they'd heard about that, both men had laughed until they could barely breathe. Blake's grandfather had been delighted to welcome her into the family, but his father still seemed to be reserving judgment, his wariness over her sticking around apparent. With his history of marriage ending in heartbreak, it made sense, and Lanie was determined to prove to him she wasn't as fickle as Blake's mother had been. Maybe if he had the chance to spend some time with Janet Richards, well, just maybe he'd lighten up and enjoy the celebration a little. Lanie hoped so. While Blake's father was occupied, Lanie dragged her new husband around to her family. They'd met Blake of course, but it was good to see how easily they accepted him. Her brothers, in particular, had finally come around, once they realized Blake was a reformed man. Or rather, he wasn't a reformed man, because he'd never been the playboy everyone thought him, but they'd both agreed to allow the lie to continue, so no one ever doubted Blossom was his. Now Lanie's family just assumed she'd changed Blake with the love they both shared. And that was true, in a lot of ways. "There's no way I'm going to be able to keep everyone straight," Blake groaned into her ear, as they danced the last slow dance. "Why in the world would your parents give all of you names? And enough of you look alike, I just know Christmases are going to be rough." She giggled, loving how right it felt to be in his arms. "Maybe we can alternate with your family. I'm just thrilled most of my side were able to be here. Even Dawn showed up, since Athena's best friend Minnie isn't here." "What?" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. But the only one missing is Didi, who's still in South Carolina. Our great-aunt is dying, and she's really close to Didi, so my sister has been living with her for a while." "I'm sorry," he murmured, and she smiled. "I'm not going to let anything ruin my happiness today, Mr. Littlelight." Blake grinned devilishly and leaned down to her ear again. "Well then, Mrs. Littlelight, how about we take our daughter home and put her to bed?" "Only if you take me home and put me to bed too," she murmured, with a lewd waggle of her brows. "Gladly." And then he scooped her up into his arms and carried her, squealing, for his truck. One of the A sisters followed with Blossom, and Blake secured her in her car seat. With shouts and cries of congratulations from the members of their reception sending them off, the three new family members drove away and headed for home. Blossom was cranky by the time they got her home, but they both knew it was only because the poor thing was up much later than usual. "This is going to completely ruin her sleep schedule," Blake grumbled, as he lugged the carrier inside. Giggling, Lanie gathered up the skirts of her wedding gown, kicked off her heels, and padded after him. "A few months ago, you were worried about your busy dating schedule, and now look at you." Her husband threw a grin over his shoulder as he headed for the baby's room. "I've never been happier." As a girl, she might have imagined her wedding day a little differently, but neither she nor Blake wanted to be separated from Blossom for even one night at her age. So even though tonight was their wedding night, they were keeping her with them. They'd decided after her first birthday, they'd leave her with the Weston family. Lord knew there were enough hands there to care for her, and take a honeymoon. But for now, it would be the three of them. A family. Lanie got herself undressed and hung the gown up in her closet, hoping someone else would be able to use it someday, then pulled on a pair of pajama bottoms and Blake's blue t-shirt. She'd been sleeping in it ever since she'd accidentally stole it from him, but tonight, she hoped not to be sleeping in much of anything at all. Grinning, she looked around the room. This would be her first night sleeping in their house, but she'd been slowly moving in over the last few weeks. The lease on her apartment was up soon anyhow, and it was an easy matter of just bringing over a new load each evening on her way home from work. So now this house was hers as much as it was his. And Blossom's too. There was already a photo of the three of them on the dresser, and a hamper full of baby onesies which needed to be folded and put away. Life was going to be hectic with a baby, but Lanie knew they could handle it as a team. She met Blake as he was coming out of Blossom's room, humming Twinkle Twinkle under his breath. He smiled and beckoned her toward the kitchen. Is she asleep? Lanie whispered, tiptoeing past the baby's room. Blake didn't answer, but when they reached the kitchen, he snagged her hand and pulled her into his embrace. He was still in his tuxedo, which made her feel frumpy. Yes, wife, our daughter is asleep. Grinning, she draped her arms around his neck. Our daughter, That has a nice ring to it. Ready to make it official? Taking a deep breath, Lanie nodded, knowing what he meant. The papers were ready for them on the kitchen table. He led her over, then handed her a pen. A few signatures, a date, and it was done. Apple Blossom Littlelight would officially become Lanie's daughter as well as Blake's. I'll add a copy of our marriage license and get these to the lawyer for processing, he said, scooping up the documents. We'll have to sign down here with a notary, but then she'll be ours. But Lanie's fingers lingered over the baby's name. Apple Blossom, she murmured. Yep. I feel like that hero who asked Aphrodite for help in winning his Atlanta, and she gave him a golden apple to toss in her path. Lanie rolled her eyes and propped her hip against the table. Your daughter is not a prize, why not? He waggled his brows and slid the rest of the papers into an envelope. Our daughter helped me win you, so I think she's more like bait, and you're my prize. Lanie snorted. That's a terrible analogy. Just wait till you hear my dad jokes. Grinning, she draped her arms around him again. I can't wait, she murmured, her gaze fixed on his lips once more. I happen to think fathers are very sexy. Well, I happen to think that you, wearing my shirt, is incredibly sexy. I'll bet you say that too. If you finish that thought with all the girls, wife, I'm going to be irritated, he growled. The way she was pressed against him, Lanie could feel how aroused he was, and her breathing began to quicken. Aren't you uncomfortable in this tuxedo, Blake? Grinning, he lowered his lips to her neck. Are you trying to get me out of it, wife? He murmured against her skin. She arched her back, allowing him better access to her neck and pressing her core against his hardness. Yes, she moaned, desperation building in intensity inside her. Well then, Blake scooped her into his arms and headed for the bedroom. If there's one thing I've learned in all of my 3 hours of being married, it's that I should make every effort to keep my wife happy. Lanie thought she might have muttered, excellent, but it was hard to know for sure, when her senses were so full of Blake. After what seemed to be a whirlwind of movement, they were both naked and in bed, locked in each other's arms. His body was so hard and perfect above hers, and when he entered her, she cried out not in pain, but in joy. They moved together, skin against skin, until she couldn't take any more. Her orgasm burst over her, and then he found his own release, and they cried out wordlessly together. After, she lay draped across his chest, all of her bones feeling as if they had somehow melted. Are you certain you're not an expert at lovemaking? She asked teasingly. That little display sure seemed as if you might have had some experience. She caught his grin, and when he shrugged, she felt it throughout her body. What can I say, Lanie? I like to read. I can't believe you learned how to do that thing with your tongue from a book. His grin turned wicked as he dragged her up his body. I may have spent some time watching some instructional videos here and there. For research. This new position dragged her sensitive nipples across the hard planes of his body and definitely distracted Lanie. For research, she murmured, her fingers making little circles on his chest, as her gaze dropped to his lips. Yeah. His voice sounded hoarse as he reached around and cupped her rear end. I believe in doing lots of research. Do you need a research assistant? Forever and always, Lanie. The sincerity in his tone dragged her gaze back up to his eyes, and she saw the affection shining there. Forever and always, Blake. He grinned, and when he flexed against her, she felt his readiness, which sent another surge of desire through her as well. I love you, wife. Grinning, she lowered her lips to his, but just before they met, she whispered, prove it. And so he did. Epilogue. Rusty brushed down the mare she'd just worked with for over an hour, pleased with how their session had gone. You did so well, Buttercup. I'm proud of you, she murmured. She didn't worry if anyone heard her talking to the horse, Because their boss, Jim Cauldron, was always talking to the horses as if they talked back to him. "Rusty, you can't avoid me forever," Cody said as he leaned against the stall gate. "Why not just talk to me and get it over with?" Where had he come from? Did the other people who worked in the horse barn just let him in? Why, what happened between us is never happening again. "You're wasting your time following me around everywhere." Cody sighed dramatically. "You are as stubborn as your red hair indicates. I don't know why you won't admit that what we have between us is good." "Very good." "Because there's nothing between us. Go home and leave me alone." She was tired. More tired than she'd ever been in her life, and she didn't have the energy to deal with him. "Are you sure that's what you want?" "Because I don't really think it is." "I know that's what I want." Rusty shook her head. "You were a drunken mistake, and a mistake that won't be repeated." She couldn't believe he was still following her around, trying to get her to talk to them. They'd never even been on a date, and he acted like they'd given up on some long-term relationship. "Look, I know I was your first. You can't just walk away that easily." Rusty blushed, hating herself for it. Redheads did not blush prettily, and her hair was, well, the color of rust. Her real name was Angelica, but no one had called her that since she was a toddler. Rusty fit her too well. "I can and I will. Don't worry, I had an itch and I scratched it. I won't be coming after you anytime soon. Move on with your life." Cody frowned. "If that's what you want." He turned and walked away, and Rusty wasn't sure if she was glad to see him go or sad he was leaving. Either way, she still had the horses, and they were the most important thing in her world. What did she need a man for anyway?